Brian Gome never imagined that translating for one desperate businesswoman would unravel the carefully hidden life he'd built in small-town Oregon. This former State Department negotiator had spent 3 years mopping floors at Portland-Hillsboro Airport, burying his diplomatic past under janitor's uniforms and single-father responsibilities. When tech executive Victoria Zhang rushed through his terminal, frantically speaking Mandarin into a dead phone while her billion-dollar merger collapsed in real time, Brian faced a choice that would expose everything he'd been hiding. What happened next would prove that some secrets are too valuable to stay buried forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if this story amazes you, make sure you hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode will absolutely blow your mind. The 5:15 a.m. alarm pierced through the thin walls of Brian Gome's cramped apartment in Beaverton, Oregon, just as it had every morning for the past 3 years. At 42, this wasn't where he'd imagined his life would lead. The man who once sat across negotiation tables from Chinese trade ministers now struggled to make rent on a 2-bedroom apartment shared with his 8-year-old daughter Riley. Brian's morning routine had become a carefully choreographed dance of survival. Coffee from yesterday's grounds heated in a microwave that worked only when you hit it just right. Riley's school clothes laid out the night before because morning decisions required energy he couldn't spare. Lunch money counted twice because there was no margin for error in their precisely calculated budget. The walls of their small living space told the story of a man caught between two worlds. Riley's colorful drawings hung beside faded diplomatic certificates that Brian kept meaning to take down but somehow never did. A photograph from his State Department days, Brian in a sharp suit shaking hands with the Chinese ambassador, sat face down in a drawer, buried under utility bills and past due notices. In the corner of their living room stood a small shrine to languages. Mandarin textbooks with worn covers, Cantonese phrase guides, and diplomatic protocol manuals that represented 15 years of Brian's life before everything changed. These books were relics now, museum pieces from a career that felt like someone else's biography. Riley stirred in her bed as Brian padded quietly to her room. At 8 years old, she possessed the adaptability that children develop when circumstances demand flexibility beyond their years. She'd learned not to ask why Daddy cleaned bathrooms when he could speak the hard Chinese language that made her friends at school stare in amazement during cultural presentation days. "Morning sunshine," Brian whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. "Mrs. Patterson is making pancakes for breakfast today, the real kind with blueberries." Their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had become their lifeline over the past year. A retired elementary school teacher with grown children scattered across the country, she'd taken Riley under her wing with the fierce protectiveness of someone who understood that some families need extra support to survive. Her small house next door had become Riley's second home, filled with warmth and consistency that Brian's work schedule couldn't always provide. The drive to Portland-Hillsboro Airport took 35 minutes through morning traffic that gave Brian too much time to think. He'd grown up in Oregon, had known these roads since college, yet lately the familiar landscape felt like a prison. The mountains that once represented adventure and possibility now seemed to hem him in, constant reminders of dreams that had been sacrificed for more pressing realities. The irony of working at an international airport wasn't lost on Brian. Planes departed daily for Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, cities where he'd once walked embassy corridors and facilitated million-dollar trade agreements. Now he watched those same aircraft through chain-link fences while emptying trash cans and mopping terminal floors. Tom Rodriguez, the airport supervisor, was already at his desk when he arrived, reviewing the morning's flight schedules over his first cup of coffee. At 58, Tom had developed an eye for recognizing both struggle and character, and he'd watched Brian navigate the past 3 years with quiet dignity that spoke to something deeper than typical employment hardship. "Morning, Brian," Tom called out without looking up from his paperwork. "Got a delegation from Xiamen Industries flying in on the 11:30 from San Francisco. Might need you to help with ground transportation if their English support person didn't make the connection. This was their unspoken arrangement. Brian's official title was maintenance technician, but his linguistic abilities had made him invaluable for the international business travelers who frequently passed through their regional airport. The additional duties never came with extra compensation, but Tom ensured Brian received overtime hours that kept Riley's after-school care affordable and their small apartment heated through Oregon's brutal winters. Brian nodded, hanging his jacket on the maintenance closet hook. These moments of linguistic service felt like brief resurrections of his former self. Glimpses of the diplomatic facilitator he'd once been before personal tragedy had reshuffled every priority in his life. The morning unfolded in its predictable rhythm. Floors mopped with industrial efficiency. Restrooms sanitized to airport standards. Windows cleaned of Pacific Northwest rain residue. Brian found a meditative quality in the physical work, his mind often drifting to Mandarin phrases and cultural protocols, while his hands maintained the pristine condition that made Portland-Hillsboro Airport a welcoming gateway to the Pacific Rim business community. During his lunch break, Brian sat in his aging Toyota Camry and called Riverside Elementary to confirm Riley's parent-teacher conference scheduled for the following week. The secretary's voice carried the practiced kindness of someone accustomed to working with single parents juggling multiple responsibilities.
Mr. Gome, Mrs. Henderson wanted me to mention that Riley's been doing exceptional work in her cultural studies unit. She's been sharing stories about Chinese traditions and language that are really engaging her classmates. Where did she learn so much about Chinese culture? Brian's grip tightened on the phone. We've studied some things together at home. Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up. Riley has a real gift for cross-cultural understanding. Mrs. Henderson thinks she might be interested in the district's new international studies track when she gets to middle school. After ending the call, Brian sat in his car for several minutes, watching planes taxi toward runways that led to destinations he'd once called home. Each aircraft represented journeys to places where his expertise had once mattered, where his ability to navigate complex cultural negotiations had facilitated agreements worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The afternoon brought a familiar ache of professional nostalgia mixed with parental pride. Riley's natural curiosity about languages and cultures reminded Brian daily of what he'd sacrificed and why that sacrifice had been necessary. Some prices were worth paying, even when they meant burying expertise that had taken decades to develop. The Shaman Industries delegation arrived precisely on schedule, a group of textile manufacturers whose adequate English couldn't quite bridge the cultural nuances of American business protocol. As Brian helped arrange their ground transportation and explained local customs, he felt the bittersweet satisfaction of using his skills meaningfully, however briefly. 您的中文说得很好, remarked the delegation leader, shaking Brian's hand. You speak Mandarin like someone who's lived in Beijing. The compliment lodged in Brian's chest, a painful reminder of embassy years and negotiation tables where his linguistic precision had opened doors and built bridges between nations. Now, those same skills served primarily to help confused travelers find rental car counters and navigate Oregon's unfamiliar highways. That evening, Brian's routine tutoring session with the Morrison twins ran longer than usual. Jessica and Jake, high school juniors preparing for their advanced placement Chinese exam, were bright students who reminded Brian why he'd originally fallen in love with diplomatic work. Their enthusiasm for mastering tonal pronunciation and understanding cultural context rekindled something in Brian that his daily maintenance routine had nearly extinguished. Mr. Gome, Jessica said as they packed up their study materials, have you ever been to China? You explain things like you've actually lived there. The question hit Brian unexpectedly. Yes, he admitted quietly. I spent some time there, work-related. What kind of work? Jake pressed with teenage curiosity. International consulting, Brian replied vaguely, a phrase that technically wasn't false but concealed the full complexity of his diplomatic background. After the twins left, Brian sat at his kitchen table grading their homework and planning next week's lessons. Riley worked on her own assignments nearby, occasionally asking questions about her social studies project on international trade. The comfortable quiet of their evening routine felt both precious and fragile, a life built from careful moments that could be disrupted by economic uncertainty or simply the relentless passage of time. "Dad," Riley said, looking up from her textbook, "Tommy Chen at school said his parents are from Taiwan and they speak Mandarin at home. Could I learn to speak it really well like you do?" Brian smiled at his daughter's ambitious curiosity. "Languages take time and practice, sweetheart, but if you're really interested, we could work on it together." "I want to be able to help people like you do sometimes," Riley continued. "Mrs. Patterson says knowing different languages is like having superpowers for understanding people." Later that night, after Riley had gone to bed, Brian stood at his kitchen window gazing out at the Oregon night sky. The stars shone with the clarity possible only in smaller cities, each one a distant light illuminating worlds beyond his current reach. He thought about Jessica Morrison's question, about the years in Beijing and Shanghai when his expertise had mattered on an international scale. Tomorrow would bring another 5:15 a.m. alarm, another day of maintenance work punctuated by brief moments of linguistic service. But tonight, Brian allowed himself to remember what it felt like when his abilities had served larger purposes than airport assistance and teenage tutoring sessions. Somewhere out there, in cities where Mandarin is the language of commerce and diplomacy, people were conducting negotiations and building relationships across cultures. He had no way of knowing that in less than 18 hours, everything would change. He couldn't foresee that fate was preparing to walk through his airport terminal carrying a business crisis that would require every skill he'd spent 3 years hiding. The kitchen clock chimed midnight, officially ending another day in the carefully constructed life of Brian Gome, former diplomat, current janitor, full-time father, and guardian of secrets that tomorrow would finally demand to be revealed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Tuesday afternoon shift at Portland-Hillsboro Airport had settled into its typical rhythm when the sliding glass doors of Terminal B burst open with unusual urgency. Brian was replacing fluorescent bulbs in the departure lounge when he heard rapid footsteps echoing across the polished floors, accompanied by a voice speaking in what sounded like distressed Mandarin. She moved through the terminal like someone whose entire world was collapsing in real time. Designer business suit, perfectly styled black hair, now slightly disheveled, and a phone pressed desperately against her ear as she spoke in rapid-fire Mandarin that carried the unmistakable tone of crisis management.
Victoria Zhang, though Brian didn't know her name yet, was the Chief Technology Officer of Nexus Dynamics, a Seattle-based company on the verge of finalizing a $2.8 billion merger with Longtang Electronics, one of China's largest semiconductor manufacturers. The deal had taken 18 months to negotiate, involved teams of lawyers on 3 continents, and represented the kind of international partnership that could reshape the global tech industry. And it was falling apart by the minute. "Boo, boo, boo!" Victoria's voice carried across the terminal as she paced near the information desk. "Tell Chairman Liu that the documentation delay is not intentional. The Seattle legal team needs 48 hours to review the intellectual property clauses, but we are committed to the merger timeline." Her phone, a high-end device that had been her lifeline throughout months of international negotiations, suddenly flickered and went completely dead. Victoria stared at the black screen in horror, tapping it frantically as if she could will it back to life through sheer desperation. "No, no, no!" She switched to English, her accent barely detectable despite the stress. "This cannot be happening. Not now." Brian watched this scene unfold from 30 feet away, immediately recognizing the particular kind of panic that comes from technology failing at the worst possible moment. But what caught his attention wasn't just her obvious distress, it was the sophisticated business Mandarin she'd been speaking. This wasn't tourist-level language or casual conversation. This was high-stakes corporate communication, the kind of precise terminology that Brian recognized from his own diplomatic days. Victoria approached the information desk, where Janet Collins, a 20-year airport veteran, greeted her with well-intentioned but limited assistance. "Ma'am, you look like you're having some trouble. Can I help you with anything?"
My phone, Victoria said, holding up the dead device. It just died completely, and I have a conference call in 20 minutes that will determine whether a $3 billion merger survives the day. I need to contact my Beijing office immediately, but the battery won't respond to charging, and I think the motherboard might have short-circuited. Janet's expression showed genuine sympathy, mixed with the helplessness of someone whose expertise ended at directing people towards gates and baggage claims. Oh, honey, that sounds awful. We don't really have phone repair services here at the airport, but there's probably a tech store in the main shopping district downtown. Maybe 30 minutes by taxi? 30 minutes, Victoria's voice cracked slightly. In 30 minutes, Chairman Liu will assume our company is no longer serious about this partnership. 18 months of negotiations will disappear because of a malfunctioning phone. She began speaking to herself in Mandarin again, her voice carrying the weight of someone calculating the catastrophic implications of a technology failure. 这是灾难，我需要立即联系刘主席。如果我错过这个电话会议，整个合并就完蛋了。Brian found himself moving closer to the conversation, his maintenance work forgotten as he processed what he was hearing. Victoria wasn't just upset about a broken phone, she was managing an international crisis that required immediate communication with Beijing. The specific business terminology she was using suggested this involved significant corporate negotiations, the kind of high-stakes international deal-making he'd once facilitated from embassy conference rooms. Is there anyone here who might know about phone repair? Victoria asked Janet desperately. Or someone who could help me contact my Beijing office through alternative means? Janet looked around the nearly empty terminal, her gaze settling on Brian, who was now standing close enough to have overheard the entire conversation. Well, she said thoughtfully, Brian over there is pretty good with technical stuff. He's helped travelers with phone problems before. Victoria turned towards Brian, and for a moment their eyes met across the cultural and professional divide that separated a former State Department diplomat from a current technology executive. In her expression, Brian recognized the look of someone drowning in circumstances beyond their control, the same expression he'd seen on his own face during his darkest moments 3 years ago. Excuse me, Victoria approached him with the careful politeness of someone who understood she was asking a favor from a stranger. I'm told you might be able to help with a phony problem. This is somewhat of an emergency. Brian looked at the device she held out, a sophisticated smartphone that showed no signs of life despite her attempts to power it on. Water damage was possible, but more likely was a motherboard failure caused by overheating or electrical surge. I can take a look, Brian said quietly, accepting the phone and immediately beginning a quick diagnostic examination. What exactly happened when it stopped working? I was in the middle of a conference call with my Beijing partners when it just went black. The battery was at 60%, so it shouldn't have been a power issue. I need to reconnect with them in, she checked her watch, 18 minutes or a $3 billion business deal collapses. As Brian examined the phone more closely, he began hearing fragments of Victoria's continued Mandarin monologue, technical business terms, merger terminology, and corporate hierarchy references that painted a picture of someone operating at the highest levels of international commerce. 掌盛会以为我们不再认真对待这次合作，这可能是我生涯的终结。The chairman will think we're no longer serious about this partnership. This could be the end of my career.
Brian's hands worked methodically on the phone while his mind processed the implications of what he was hearing. This wasn't just a frustrated traveler with a broken device. This was a high-level executive managing a crisis that involved precisely the kind of China-US business relationship he'd once helped facilitate from the diplomatic side. And she had no idea that the airport janitor examining her phone had once sat in rooms where similar deals were structured, negotiated, and finalized. The phone's internal components told a story of sophisticated technology pushed beyond its limits. The motherboard showed signs of electrical stress, likely caused by the kind of intensive international usage that Brian recognized from his own diplomatic days. Constant international calls, secure communications, and the kind of technological demands that came with managing relationships across multiple time zones. The motherboard has suffered a cascading failure, Brian said, his technical diagnosis delivered with the precision that came from years of dealing with diplomatic communication equipment. But the data should still be recoverable. The problem is that repair requires specialized tools and probably 90 minutes of careful work. Victoria's face went pale. 90 minutes? I don't have 90 minutes. I have 15 minutes before the most important phone call of my professional life, and no way to make that call happen. She began pacing again, switching back to Mandarin as the stress overwhelmed her careful English composure. 这是不可能的情况，我需要奇迹. This is an impossible situation. I need a miracle. Brian watched her growing desperation and felt the familiar pull of someone whose expertise could solve a problem that seemed insurmountable to others. For 3 years, he'd carefully hidden his diplomatic background, his fluency in Mandarin, and his understanding of exactly the kind of international business crisis that Victoria was facing. But standing in the middle of Portland-Hillsboro Airport, watching a capable executive face the collapse of 18 months of work because of technological failure, Brian realized that some skills were too valuable to keep buried forever. Especially when someone was drowning in a situation he was uniquely qualified to resolve. "Victoria," he said quietly, using her name for the first time and causing her to turn toward him with surprise. "What if I told you there might be another way to handle this crisis, one that doesn't require fixing your phone at all?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither of them fully understood yet. Victoria studied Brian's face, searching for any sign that this airport maintenance worker might possess answers to problems that had stumped teams of corporate technicians. "What kind of other way?" she asked, her voice containing the first hint of hope she'd felt since her phone died. Brian glanced around the terminal, calculating risks and possibilities with the strategic thinking that had once made him valuable in embassy conference rooms. In 15 minutes, Victoria needed to be in contact with Beijing. Her phone was dead, repair shops were too far away, and traditional solutions had already failed. But Brian Gome possessed resources that Victoria Zhang couldn't have imagined, including fluency in the exact language she needed and experience with precisely the kind of international crisis she was facing. The question was whether he was ready to reveal 3 years of carefully hidden expertise to save a stranger's business deal, and whether doing so would finally unlock the door he'd been keeping closed on his own professional possibilities. Brian's mind raced through possibilities as Victoria stared at him with desperate hope. 14 minutes remained before her critical conference call, and every second of delay moved her closer to professional catastrophe. Around them, the airport continued its normal operations, passengers checking departure boards, travelers wheeling luggage toward gates, completely unaware that a multi-billion-dollar international merger hung in the balance of this conversation. "Follow me," Brian said, making a decision that would change both their lives. "There's a conference room in the administrative wing that has international calling capabilities and video conferencing equipment. It's normally reserved for airport management, but given the circumstances..." Victoria's eyes widened with surprise. This was not the kind of solution she'd expected from an airport maintenance worker. "You can access administrative facilities? Are you authorized to?" "Sometimes emergency situations require flexible interpretations of protocol," Brian replied, his tone carrying the diplomatic authority that had once made him valuable in embassy settings. "The question is whether you trust me to help you navigate this crisis." As they walked quickly toward the administrative corridor, Victoria continued her anxious Mandarin monologue, unaware that Brian was following every word. 如果我能联系到刘主席，也许还有希望，但是我需要解释为什么我迟到了原定的电话会议，他会认为这是不专业的表现。
Brian used his maintenance access card to unlock the conference room door, revealing a space equipped with sophisticated communication technology that rivaled what he'd used during his State Department years. Multiple monitors, high-definition cameras, and audio equipment designed for international business communications filled the room. "This is incredible," Victoria breathed, looking around the setup. "How did you know this existed, and how do you have access?"
Airport maintenance requires access to all facilities, Brian replied, which was technically true but didn't explain his familiarity with diplomatic-grade communication equipment. "Let me help you establish the connection to Beijing." Victoria pulled out her business notes and began dialing the Beijing office number on the conference room phone. After several attempts, she managed to reach Chairman Liu's assistant, but the conversation immediately encountered obstacles. "Hello, this is Victoria Zhang from Nexus Dynamics. I need to speak urgently with Chairman Liu about our merger discussion." "What? No, I understand he's concerned about the missed call. Yes, I realize this appears unprofessional, but there were technical difficulties." Brian watched Victoria struggle with the formal English required for international business protocol while managing the cultural sensitivity needed when apologizing to high-ranking Chinese executives. Her English was excellent, but the stress was affecting her ability to navigate the complex diplomatic language required for this situation. The assistant's responses, audible through the speakerphone, indicated growing skepticism about Victoria's explanations and increasing reluctance to disturb Chairman Liu with what might appear to be excuses for poor planning. "I understand your position," frustration creeping into her voice, "but if I could just explain the circumstances directly to Chairman Liu, I believe we can resolve this misunderstanding and proceed with our scheduled merger timeline." The conversation was clearly deteriorating. Victoria's attempts to explain the technical failure sounded increasingly desperate through the formal diplomatic channels, and the Beijing assistant seemed unconvinced that this crisis warranted interrupting the chairman's busy schedule. Brian made another decision that would reveal more of his hidden background. "Victoria," he said quietly, "would you mind if I tried a different approach to this communication?" She looked at him with confusion mixed with desperation. "What kind of different approach? I don't understand what you could do that I haven't already tried." "Trust me for 2 minutes," Brian replied, then stepped closer to the speakerphone. Without any warning or preparation, he began speaking in fluent, sophisticated Mandarin that immediately transformed the entire conversation. "您好，这是 Portland-Hillsboro 机场的 Brian Gome。我现在代表 Nexus Dynamics 的首席技术官 Victoria Zhang 女士处理一个需要立即关注的紧急情况。Hello, this is Brian Gome from Portland-Hillsboro Airport. I am currently representing Ms. Victoria Zhang, Chief Technology Officer of Nexus Dynamics, regarding an emergency situation that requires immediate attention." The change in the Beijing assistant's tone was instantaneous. Brian's Mandarin wasn't just fluent, it carried the formal diplomatic register and cultural protocols that indicated sophisticated understanding of Chinese business hierarchy and international communication etiquette. 请问，您是哪位？您的中文非常好。您在这次商业谈判中担任什么角色？ I am an international relations coordinator specializing in communication issues within China-US business partnerships. 张女士遇到了不可避免的技术故障，但她对于龙腾 Electronics 的合并仍然完全全力支持。我们希望能够重新安排与刘主席的会议，以表明我们对这一重要伙伴关系的尊重。Victoria stared at Brian in complete shock. The maintenance worker who had been examining her broken phone was now conducting sophisticated diplomatic communication in perfect Mandarin, using terminology and cultural protocols that suggested deep familiarity with high-level international business relationships. The Beijing assistant's attitude transformed completely. Brian's approach demonstrated the kind of cultural sensitivity and formal respect that Chinese business culture demanded, while his linguistic precision indicated someone with serious diplomatic experience.
请稍等，我立即联系刘主席。您的解释表明了对我们文化和商业实践的真正理解。Within 3 minutes, 11 minutes before Victoria's original deadline, Chairman Liu himself was on the conference call. Brian facilitated the initial introductions with the diplomatic finesse that had once made him valuable in embassy settings, then smoothly transitioned the conversation to allow Victoria to present her technical explanations and merger timeline commitments. 刘主席，我现在请张女士直接与您讨论合并的具体细节。她的技术专长和对这次伙伴关系的承诺将会让您印象深刻。Victoria, still processing the revelation that her helpful janitor was apparently a skilled diplomatic interpreter, managed to regain her professional composure and present her merger timeline with renewed confidence. Chairman Liu, reassured by Brian's culturally appropriate introduction and explanation, listened with the attention and respect that the 18-month negotiation deserved.
The conversation proceeded smoothly for 20 minutes, with Brian occasionally providing subtle linguistic assistance when complex technical concepts required precise translation between English and Mandarin. His interventions were minimal but crucial, facilitating understanding at exactly the moments when cultural or linguistic barriers might have created confusion. By the end of the call, not only was the merger back on track, but Chairman Liu had specifically requested that Brian participate in future communications to ensure smooth coordination between the American and Chinese teams. Mr. Gome, Chairman Liu said in careful English before ending the call, your diplomatic skills and cultural understanding have been invaluable today. I hope Nexus Dynamics recognizes what an asset you are to their international operations. After the call ended, Victoria sat in stunned silence, staring at Brian as if seeing him for the first time. The maintenance uniform and airport setting suddenly seemed like elaborate disguises, concealing someone with diplomatic expertise she'd never encountered outside of embassy settings. "Who are you?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. That wasn't just good Mandarin, that was diplomatic-level communication. You handled cultural protocols like someone with years of high-level international experience. Brian looked around the conference room, calculating how much truth he was prepared to reveal. For 3 years, he'd successfully hidden his background from everyone except Tom Rodriguez, who'd hired him despite his overqualifications because good maintenance workers were hard to find. Now, in the span of 30 minutes, he demonstrated abilities that couldn't be explained by casual language study or occasional airport assistance. I used to work in international relations, Brian said carefully, before Riley was born, before circumstances changed my priorities. International relations? Victoria pressed. What kind of international relations? Cultural attaché, trade representative, commercial liaison? State Department, Brian admitted quietly. Diplomatic negotiations between the U.S. and China. Trade agreements, cultural exchanges, business partnership facilitation. I spent 7 years posted in Beijing and Shanghai working on exactly the kind of merger agreements you're managing with Longtang Electronics. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, processing the implications of what she'd just learned. A former State Department diplomat with 7 years of China experience was working as an airport janitor in Oregon, using his sophisticated diplomatic skills to help stranded travelers with phone problems and transportation arrangements. Brian, she said slowly, you just saved an 18-month negotiation and a $3 billion merger using skills that most international corporations would pay enormous salaries to access. What are you doing cleaning floors at a regional airport? The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither of them fully understood yet. Brian had revealed abilities that Victoria's company desperately needed, while Victoria had witnessed the demonstration of expertise that Brian had been hiding from the world for 3 years. It's complicated, Brian replied, thinking about Riley's school schedule, Mrs. Patterson's reliable childcare, and the carefully constructed life that provided stability even if it didn't provide fulfillment.
Complicated how? Victoria asked. Because what I just witnessed wasn't complicated, it was extraordinary. You have abilities that could reshape how American companies approach Chinese business relationships. Why are you keeping those abilities secret? Brian realized that answering that question honestly would require explaining everything. The diplomatic career that had ended abruptly, the single father responsibilities that had forced impossible choices, and the 3 years of carefully buried expertise that had just been dramatically revealed. "Let's just say," Brian replied carefully, "that sometimes circumstances require people to make choices that don't reflect their professional capabilities." Victoria studied his face, recognizing the expression of someone whose life had been shaped by events beyond their control. She'd built her career on identifying talent that others overlooked, and she'd just witnessed the most dramatic example of hidden potential she'd ever encountered. "Brian," she said finally, "I think we need to have a much longer conversation. What you just did for me, for my company, that wasn't a favor between strangers. That was professional expertise of the highest level, delivered at exactly the moment when it could make the difference between success and catastrophic failure." Brian glanced at his watch, calculating the time until his shift ended and Riley needed to be picked up from school. The ordinary world of maintenance schedules and parental responsibilities was calling him back, but Victoria's words carried implications that he wasn't sure he was ready to explore. "I should get back to work," he said. "Tom will be wondering where I disappeared to, and I have afternoon duties to complete." "Work?" Victoria's voice carried disbelief. "Brian, you just facilitated a $3 billion international merger using diplomatic skills that most corporations would kill to access, and you're worried about getting back to maintenance duties?" The contrast she'd highlighted was impossible to ignore. In the span of 30 minutes, Brian had demonstrated abilities that operated at the highest levels of international commerce, then immediately returned to concerns about janitorial schedules and supervisor expectations. "This is my life now," Brian said simply. "I have responsibilities that take priority over professional ambitions." Victoria nodded, but her expression indicated that she wasn't prepared to let this conversation end with a return to ordinary airport maintenance routines. "Brian," she said as they prepared to leave the conference room, "what if I told you that your responsibilities and your professional capabilities didn't have to be mutually exclusive? What if there was a way to honor both without sacrificing either?" The question would echo in Brian's mind for the rest of his shift, planting seeds of possibility in carefully protected ground that hadn't been disturbed for 3 years. The administrative conference room had been returned to its pristine condition, but the weight of what had just transpired lingered in the air between them. Victoria gathered her notes while Brian systematically shut down the communication equipment with the practiced efficiency of someone intimately familiar with diplomatic technology protocols. Neither spoke immediately, both processing the implications of the past hour's revelations. "Brian," Victoria said finally, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and professional curiosity that hadn't been satisfied by his brief explanations. "I need to understand something. What we just accomplished in there, that wasn't beginner's luck or exceptional intuition. You navigated Chinese business hierarchy and cultural protocols like someone with decades of high-level diplomatic experience." Brian paused in his equipment shutdown routine, recognizing that Victoria's questions deserved more comprehensive answers than the deflections he'd offered inside the conference room. Her merger crisis had been resolved, but her discovery of his background had created new complications that couldn't be dismissed with references to maintenance schedules. "You're right," he admitted, turning to face her directly. 7 years with the State Department's China desk, 3 years stationed in Beijing at the embassy, 4 years traveling between Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong facilitating trade negotiations and cultural exchanges. I specialized in technology transfer agreements and intellectual property partnerships, exactly the kind of merger you were negotiating with Longtang Electronics." Victoria studied his face, searching for signs of exaggeration or embellishment, but Brian's expression carried the quiet confidence of someone stating verifiable facts rather than impressive claims. Technology transfer agreements, she repeated slowly. Brian, do you realize how rare that expertise is? Most international law firms charge $5,000 per day for consultants with your background. I'm aware of the market value, Brian replied, with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But market value and life circumstances don't always align in convenient ways. What circumstances? Victoria asked gently, recognizing that she was approaching sensitive territory. What happened that brought someone with your qualifications to airport maintenance work in Oregon? Brian was quiet for a long moment, calculating how much personal history he was prepared to share with someone he'd met 2 hours earlier. But Victoria's genuine curiosity and the unexpected intimacy created by their successful collaboration made complete honesty feel safer than continued deflection. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said simply. "Cancer. The diagnosis came 6 months after Riley was born, and the treatment required 2 years of intensive medical care that wasn't covered by diplomatic insurance. I took extended leave to be her caregiver, which eventually became permanent leave when it became clear that she wasn't going to recover." Victoria's expression softened with understanding. "I'm so sorry. That must have been devastating on every level." "Sarah was brilliant," Brian continued, his voice carrying the warmth that always accompanied memories of his late wife. PhD in international economics from Georgetown, fluent in Mandarin and Cantonese, better at cultural negotiations than I was. We met at an embassy reception in Beijing. She was working for the World Bank on sustainable development projects. Our partnership was professional before it became personal. "She sounds extraordinary," Victoria said quietly. She was, and she would have been horrified by the medical bills we accumulated trying to save her life. $200,000 in experimental treatments that insurance classified as investigational rather than necessary. I liquidated our savings, borrowed against my pension, and finally resigned from the State Department to take a position with a consulting firm that paid enough to cover the ongoing expenses. Brian moved to the conference room window, looking out at the airport tarmac where planes were preparing for destinations he'd once called home. The consulting work lasted 18 months, until Sarah passed away, and I realized that Riley needed stability more than I needed professional fulfillment. An 8-year-old doesn't benefit from a father who travels internationally 60% of the time, no matter how prestigious the work might be. Victoria found herself genuinely moved by the story, recognizing the impossible choices that had shaped Brian's current circumstances. "So you chose Riley's stability over career advancement." "I chose being present for the only family I had left," Brian corrected gently. "Tom Rodriguez hired me, despite my overqualifications, because he understood that sometimes good people need employment that accommodates life complications. Airport maintenance provides steady income, predictable hours, and health insurance that covers Riley's needs. It's not glamorous, but it's reliable." "But surely there were other options," Victoria pressed. "Consulting work that allowed remote participation, international firms that needed China expertise but offered flexible arrangements." Brian's laugh carried no humor. "Have you ever tried explaining employment gaps to international consulting firms? I spent 2 years as a caregiver and then chose airport maintenance to prioritize single parenting. Doesn't typically impress corporate recruiters looking for aggressive career advancement and limitless travel availability." "That's ridiculous," Victoria said with genuine anger. "You demonstrated more sophisticated diplomatic expertise in 30 minutes than most consultants deliver in entire projects. Any firm would be fortunate to access your abilities." "Perhaps," Brian acknowledged, "but most firms don't discover employee capabilities through airport emergencies. Under normal circumstances, my resume reflects 3 years of maintenance work with an unexplained gap in diplomatic experience. Not exactly the profile that generates enthusiasm from international business consultants." Victoria began pacing the small conference room, her mind clearly working through possibilities that Brian couldn't yet see. "What if circumstances weren't normal?" she asked suddenly. "What if someone recognized your abilities and could offer opportunities that accommodate your family responsibilities rather than ignoring them?" "Victoria," Brian said carefully,
I appreciate what you're suggesting, but I've learned to be realistic about my limitations. Riley needs consistency, and I can't afford to take risks with employment stability. What we accomplished today was exceptional, but it doesn't change my fundamental responsibilities. What if it could change how you fulfill those responsibilities? Victoria countered. Brian, Nexus Dynamics has been struggling with China market entry for 3 years. We've hired 4 different consulting firms, spent nearly $2 million on cultural training and relationship building, and still haven't achieved the kind of breakthrough that you facilitated in one 30-minute phone call. Brian studied her expression, recognizing the focused intensity that characterized successful executives when they identified solutions to persistent problems. You're talking about offering me employment. I'm talking about offering you the opportunity to use your abilities at the level they deserve while maintaining the family stability you've prioritized. Remote consultation with quarterly travel requirements. Family-inclusive benefits that would cover Riley's needs comprehensively. Compensation that reflects the market value of diplomatic expertise rather than maintenance skills. The offer hung in the air between them, representing possibilities that Brian had convinced himself were no longer available. For 3 years, he'd carefully constructed a life that prioritized security over ambition, stability over opportunity. Victoria's proposal challenged the fundamental assumptions that had shaped every choice since Sarah's death. "You're serious," Brian said, studying her face for signs of impulsive enthusiasm that might fade once the gratitude for today's assistance diminished. "Completely serious," Victoria confirmed. "What you did today saved my company from a catastrophic failure that would have set back our China expansion by years. But more than that, you demonstrated exactly the kind of cultural expertise and diplomatic finesse that we've been trying to develop through expensive consulting contracts and ineffective training programs." Brian moved back to the window, watching afternoon flights prepare for departure while processing the implications of Victoria's offer. "This morning I was replacing fluorescent bulbs and planning Riley's parent-teacher conference. Now you're suggesting I return to international consulting?" "I'm suggesting you never should have left international consulting," Victoria replied. "I'm suggesting that circumstances forced you to make choices that undervalued your capabilities, and that perhaps it's time to explore whether those circumstances have changed enough to allow different choices." "The circumstances haven't changed," Brian pointed out. "Riley still needs stability, consistency, and a father who's present for parent-teacher conferences and soccer practice and bedtime stories. I can't recreate the demands that made my original career incompatible with single parenting." "What if you didn't have to recreate those demands?" Victoria asked. "What if we could design a position that honored both your professional expertise and your parental priorities? Remote work as the primary model, with strategic travel that accommodates Riley's schedule and includes family-friendly logistics when necessary." Brian found himself genuinely considering possibilities he'd dismissed for 3 years. "You're talking about rebuilding international consulting around family integration rather than family sacrifice. I'm talking about recognizing that talent and family responsibility aren't mutually exclusive," Victoria said firmly. "I'm talking about a company that's smart enough to accommodate exceptional abilities rather than demanding that exceptional people abandon their personal values to access professional opportunities." "And you believe Nexus Dynamics would support this kind of arrangement?" Victoria's smile carried the confidence of someone who understood both corporate dynamics and bottom-line realities. "Brian, you saved us from losing the most important business relationship we've developed in 5 years of China market efforts. The board of directors would approve any reasonable accommodation to secure ongoing access to your expertise." "Define reasonable accommodation," Brian said, his tone indicating serious consideration rather than polite deflection. "Home office setup that rivals what we just used for the Chairman Liu call. Flexible scheduling that prioritizes Riley's needs and school calendar. Family health insurance that eliminates any concerns about medical coverage. Quarterly trips to China that include family travel options and extended stays that allow Riley to experience international culture as an educational opportunity rather than a disruption." Brian realized that Victoria was describing exactly the kind of professional arrangement he'd once dreamed about but had never believed possible. "You've thought about this in considerable detail for someone who learned about my background 2 hours ago." "I've been thinking about China market strategy for 3 years," Victoria replied. "What I learned 2 hours ago was that the solution to our most persistent challenge was working 30 feet away from where I had my breakdown. The detailed planning is just good business development." "What about Riley's reaction to this kind of change?" Brian asked. "She's adapted to our current life, developed friendships at school, established routines with Mrs. Patterson. Uprooting that stability for professional opportunities feels selfish." "What if it wasn't uprooting?" Victoria suggested. "What if it was expanding? Keeping the Oregon base that provides Riley stability while adding opportunities for international experience that could shape her understanding of the world. You mentioned that she's already showing interest in languages and cultures." Brian thought about Riley's recent questions about Chinese culture, her fascination with his occasional Mandarin phrases, and her expressed desire to help people like he sometimes did. "She has been asking about learning Mandarin seriously, and her teacher mentioned that the district has an international studies track that might interest her. Riley could learn Mandarin from someone with native diplomatic fluency while experiencing a cultures that shaped those languages. She could understand international business relationships from someone who's actually negotiated them. That's not disruption, that's educational opportunity that most children never access." Brian found himself imagining Riley's excitement about international travel, her curiosity about different cultures, and her natural adaptability to new experiences. "She would be thrilled by the travel opportunities. She's been asking about the places I used to work."
Then maybe, Victoria said gently, it's time to consider whether the choices that were necessary 3 years ago are still necessary today. Maybe Riley's stability doesn't require limiting your professional capabilities. Maybe it requires honoring them in ways that include rather than exclude family priorities. The conversation had evolved from gratitude for emergency assistance to serious consideration of life-changing possibilities. Brian realized that Victoria was offering not just employment, but the opportunity to reclaim professional identity without sacrificing the family values that had guided every decision since Sarah's death. "This would be a significant risk," Brian said finally, "leaving secure employment for possibilities that might not develop as positively as we're discussing." "Every meaningful opportunity involves risk," Victoria acknowledged. "But sometimes the greatest risk is refusing to explore possibilities that could transform struggle into fulfillment. What you did today proved that your abilities deserve larger stages than maintenance schedules and occasional airport assistance." Brian looked at Victoria's earnest expression, recognizing someone who understood both professional excellence and personal sacrifice. "If I were to consider this seriously, what would be the next steps?" Victoria's smile indicated that she'd been hoping for exactly this question. "Coffee tomorrow evening, after Riley's school day ends. Detailed discussion of position requirements, family logistics, and compensation structure. Meet Riley so she can evaluate whether this sounds like an adventure worth taking or a disruption to be avoided." "You want to meet Riley before finalizing any employment discussion?" "I want to meet the person whose needs have shaped every choice you've made for 3 years, Victoria said simply. "If this arrangement doesn't work for Riley, it won't work for anyone." Brian extended his hand with the formal courtesy that had once characterized diplomatic agreements. "Coffee tomorrow evening. Detailed discussion. No commitments beyond serious consideration." Victoria shook his hand, recognizing that they'd just moved from emergency assistance to genuine possibility. "Thank you, Brian, for today's help and for being willing to explore what might come next." As they prepared to leave the conference room that had witnessed both crisis resolution and life-changing conversation, Brian realized that his carefully constructed ordinary world was already beginning to shift in ways that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The administrative corridor felt different as they walked back toward the main terminal, charged with the electricity of possibilities that hadn't existed 2 hours earlier. Brian's maintenance cart waited exactly where he'd left it, surrounded by the fluorescent bulbs and cleaning supplies that represented his current reality. The contrast between diplomatic conference rooms and janitorial equipment had never felt more stark. "This feels surreal," Brian admitted as they approached the boundary between administrative spaces and public areas. "3 hours ago, I was worried about completing my afternoon checklist. Now I'm considering international consulting opportunities that could reshape Riley's entire future." Victoria paused near the security checkpoint that would separate them, pulling out her business card with the deliberate ceremony of someone who understood the significance of this exchange. "Sometimes life's most important transitions happen in the span of a single conversation," she said, handing him the card. "The question is whether we're brave enough to recognize those moments when they occur." Brian accepted the card, noting the elegant typography and corporate logo that represented the world he'd once inhabited. Victoria Zhang, Chief Technology Officer, Nexus Dynamics. The title carried weight that extended far beyond airport emergencies and broken phones. "I should mention," Victoria said, her tone becoming more serious, "that what happened today, your assistance with the merger crisis, it's already being discussed at the highest levels of my company. Chairman Liu specifically requested your contact information for future communications. That's not a casual request in Chinese business culture." "Meaning what, exactly?" Brian asked, though he suspected he understood the implications. "Meaning that whether or not you accept my employment offer, you've already been identified as someone valuable to Longtang Electronics' American partnerships. Chairman Liu doesn't make such requests lightly, and once you're in his professional network, opportunities tend to multiply in ways you can't always predict or control." Brian felt a familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety that had once accompanied his diplomatic career's most significant moments. "So, even if I decline your offer, the professional visibility from today's call might create other complications." "Or other opportunities," Victoria corrected gently. "Brian, you've spent 3 years hiding extraordinary abilities. Today's events make that concealment much more difficult to maintain. The question isn't whether your professional situation will change, it's whether you'll have control over how it changes." The observation carried uncomfortable truth. Brian's careful anonymity had been shattered by 30 minutes of diplomatic expertise, creating ripple effects that would be impossible to reverse. Tom Rodriguez would want explanations for his extended absence. Other airport staff had witnessed Victoria's obvious distress, followed by her transformation into a confident executive preparing for international travel. Questions would be asked that couldn't be deflected with references to routine maintenance duties. "I hadn't considered the visibility factor," Brian admitted. "I've become comfortable with professional invisibility. Having Chinese executives requesting my contact information definitely complicates that status." Victoria's expression showed understanding mixed with gentle challenge. "Maybe professional invisibility isn't serving you as well as you've convinced yourself. Maybe it's time to consider whether hiding your abilities protects Riley's stability or limits her opportunities." Before Brian could respond, his radio crackled with Tom Rodriguez's voice, requesting his location for the afternoon briefing. The ordinary world was calling him back to responsibilities that suddenly felt constraining rather than comforting.
"I need to report to my supervisor," Brian said, clipping the radio back to his belt. "He'll want to know why I disappeared for an hour during my shift." "What will you tell him?" Victoria asked with genuine curiosity. "The truth, probably. Tom hired me despite knowing I was overqualified for maintenance work. He's been accommodating about my occasional language assistance with international travelers, but today's level of involvement goes far beyond his normal expectations." Victoria pulled out her phone, checking the time with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing multiple priorities simultaneously. "My flight to Seattle boards in 40 minutes. I need to call my Beijing team and brief them on today's developments before takeoff." "Back to corporate headquarters to explain how a merger crisis was resolved by an airport janitor?" Brian asked with a slight smile. "Back to corporate headquarters to explain how we discovered the exact expertise we've been seeking for 3 years, Victoria replied seriously. "Brian, I want you to understand something.
What happened today wasn't luck or coincidence. You possess abilities that my company desperately needs, and our meeting occurred at precisely the moment when those abilities could make the difference between success and failure. And you believe that kind of timing means something significant? Victoria was quiet for a moment, considering her response carefully. I believe that when exceptional people encounter opportunities that perfectly match their capabilities, refusing to explore those opportunities becomes more risky than embracing them. Brian found himself studying her face, recognizing the focused intensity that had probably contributed to her rise to executive leadership. "You're very persuasive." "I'm very practical," Victoria corrected. "And practically speaking, you just demonstrated that your current employment arrangement dramatically underutilizes abilities that could benefit both your family and my company. Exploring how to address that underutilization isn't persuasion, it's problem-solving." The announcement for Victoria's flight echoed through the terminal, indicating that boarding would begin in 15 minutes. The external timeline was imposing itself on their conversation, creating natural pressure to reach resolution or establish clear next steps. "Coffee tomorrow evening," Brian repeated, confirming their agreement. Detailed discussion with Riley included. 6 o'clock at Riverside Cafe on Maple Street. It's family-friendly, quiet enough for serious conversation, and close enough to Riley's school that pickup logistics won't be complicated. Brian was surprised by her attention to practical details that demonstrated consideration for his parental responsibilities. "You've researched family-friendly locations near Riley's school?" "I've researched everything relevant to making this opportunity work for your family," Victoria admitted without embarrassment. "If I'm going to propose significant changes to your life, I want those changes to be realistic rather than theoretical." That level of preparation is either impressive or slightly concerning. "It's thorough," Victoria replied, matching his tone. "I don't make business proposals without understanding all relevant factors. Your family logistics are definitely relevant factors." Brian's radio crackled again, with increasing urgency in Tom's voice. "I really do need to report for briefing before he sends security to find me." Victoria extended her hand, with the formal courtesy that characterized professional farewell. "Thank you, Brian, for today's assistance, for serious consideration of tomorrow's discussion, and for reminding me that the most valuable expertise often exists in unexpected places." Brian shook her hand, noting the firm confidence that had probably impressed countless business partners and board members. "Thank you for recognizing abilities that most people wouldn't notice, and for offering possibilities that most companies wouldn't accommodate. See you tomorrow evening," Victoria said, shouldering her travel bag and heading toward the security checkpoint. 6 o'clock, Riley included, serious possibilities discussed. "Tomorrow evening," Brian confirmed, watching her disappear into the stream of travelers heading toward departure gates. Alone with his maintenance cart and the business card that represented potential transformation, Brian found himself processing the afternoon's events with the analytical approach that had once served him well in diplomatic settings. Victoria's offer was legitimate, her company's needs were genuine, and her proposed accommodations addressed every practical concern he'd raised about family stability and parental responsibilities. But accepting her proposal would mean abandoning the carefully constructed life that had provided security through 3 years of single parenthood. It would mean returning to professional environments that demanded excellence and delivered pressure in equal measure. It would mean exposing Riley to possibilities that might expand her world or disrupt her sense of home. Most significantly, it would mean trusting that his abilities remained as valuable as Victoria believed, despite 3 years of intentional professional hibernation. Brian's radio demanded immediate attention, and he reluctantly pushed his cart toward the administrative offices where Tom was waiting with questions that would require explanations about disappeared maintenance workers and extended conferences with distressed travelers. But as he walked through the terminal where his ordinary life intersected with international possibilities, Brian realized that Victoria's observation about professional invisibility carried uncomfortable accuracy. He'd become so focused on protecting Riley's stability that he'd never considered whether his current choices were limiting her opportunities rather than ensuring them. The business card in his pocket felt heavier than its physical weight suggested, representing decisions that could reshape everything he'd carefully constructed since Sarah's death.
Tomorrow evening's conversation will determine whether those potential changes represented growth or disruption, opportunity or risk. Either way, Brian understood that his carefully maintained anonymity had been permanently altered by 30 minutes of diplomatic expertise. Whether he accepts Victoria's offer or declines it, his professional situation will never again be as simple as maintenance schedules and occasional language assistance. The only question remaining was whether he would control the direction of that change or simply react to its inevitable consequences. As he approached Tom's office, preparing explanations for the afternoon's extended absence, Brian found himself thinking about Riley's recent questions about international cultures and her expressed interest in helping people understand each other across language barriers. Perhaps it was time to discover whether his daughter's adventurous spirit was inherited and whether their family's next chapter might be written in Mandarin as well as English. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Tom Rodriguez looked up from his afternoon reports as Brian knocked on the office door, his weathered face showing the particular expression of a supervisor who'd been managing people long enough to recognize when routine explanations wouldn't suffice for unusual circumstances. "Come in, Brian," Tom said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. "I've been getting interesting reports about maintenance staff conducting high-level business meetings in our conference facilities. Want to fill me in on what's been happening during your extended lunch break?" Brian settled into the familiar chair where he'd sat countless times for routine briefings and schedule discussions, but today's conversation would require explanations that ventured far beyond typical maintenance protocols. A traveler had a technology emergency that required assistance beyond standard airport services. The situation escalated into something more complex than I initially anticipated. Complex how? Tom leaned back in his chair with the patient expression of someone prepared to hear whatever explanation emerged. "Janet mentioned that you were speaking what sounded like fluent Chinese with a very upset businesswoman. Since when do our maintenance staff provide diplomatic translation services?" The question Brian had been dreading since Victoria's departure couldn't be avoided any longer. Tom had hired him despite obvious overqualifications, had accommodated his occasional language assistance with international travelers, and had never pressed for details about the employment gap that preceded his airport position. But today's events had moved far beyond the boundaries of their unspoken understanding. "Tom," Brian said carefully, "what do you know about my background before I started working here? I know you were overqualified for maintenance work, spoke multiple languages, and needed employment that accommodated single parenting responsibilities." Tom replied honestly. "I also know that good people sometimes need jobs that provide stability rather than challenge, and I was comfortable hiring someone whose abilities exceeded the position requirements." "And you never wondered about the specifics of why someone with language skills would choose airport maintenance?" Tom's expression grew more serious. "Brian, I've been supervising people for 30 years. I've learned that when capable employees need work arrangements that seem below their qualifications, there are usually personal circumstances that make those arrangements necessary. I figured you'd share details if and when you felt comfortable doing so." Brian appreciated Tom's respectful approach to personal privacy, but realized that continued evasion would be both unfair and impractical given the afternoon's developments. "I used to work for the State Department, diplomatic assignments in China, specializing in trade negotiations and business partnerships. 7 years of embassy postings before family circumstances required career changes." Tom's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression showed understanding rather than surprise. "That explains the language abilities and the occasional help you've provided with international travelers. What were the family circumstances that brought you to airport maintenance?" "My wife died 3 years ago after expensive medical treatment that wasn't fully covered by diplomatic insurance. I resigned to focus on single parenting and took this position because it provided the stability and predictability that Riley needed during a difficult transition." "And today's situation with the upset businesswoman somehow involved using your diplomatic background?" Brian found himself describing the merger crisis, Victoria's technological emergency, and the 30-minute conference call that had saved a $3 billion international partnership. As he spoke, Tom's expression evolved from curiosity to genuine amazement. "Let me understand this correctly,"
Tom said when Brian finished his explanation. "You facilitated a major international business deal using diplomatic expertise that none of us knew you possessed, and in the process, you impressed Chinese executives to the point where they specifically requested your contact information for future communications." "That's an accurate summary," Brian confirmed. Tom was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that extended far beyond afternoon duty schedules and maintenance protocols. "Brian, what you're describing isn't occasional language assistance. That's high-level international consulting work performed by someone with sophisticated diplomatic training." "Yes," Brian agreed simply. "And this businesswoman, Victoria Zhang, she recognized the value of what you did. She offered me a position with her company, international consulting work that would accommodate family responsibilities while utilizing diplomatic expertise." Tom leaned forward with the focused attention he typically reserved for serious personnel discussions. "What kind of position?" Brian outlined Victoria's proposal, explaining the remote work arrangements, family-inclusive benefits, and compensation structure that had been discussed during their extended conference room conversation. As he spoke, Tom's expression showed the particular thoughtfulness that preceded important supervisory decisions. "Brian," Tom said finally, "I need to ask you something directly. Why are you telling me about this offer? Are you planning to resign from airport maintenance to return to international consulting?" "I'm planning to have coffee with Victoria tomorrow evening to discuss the possibility seriously. Riley will be included in that conversation because any decision would significantly affect her life as well as mine." "And how do you feel about the possibility?" Brian was surprised by the question's directness and by his own uncertainty about the answer. "Conflicted," he admitted. 3 years ago, I made conscious choices to prioritize Riley's stability over professional advancement. Those choices led to security and predictability that have served our family well. Victoria's offer would mean returning to professional environments that demand excellence but also deliver pressure and uncertainty. But it would also mean using abilities that are clearly being wasted in maintenance work," Tom pointed out gently.
"Are they being wasted?" Brian asked. "I've been telling myself that providing Riley with stability and being present for her daily needs represents the best use of my abilities during this phase of our lives." Tom studied Brian's face with the perceptive understanding that had made him an effective supervisor for 3 decades. "What does Riley think about international cultures and languages?" "She's fascinated by them," Brian admitted. "She's been asking about learning Mandarin seriously, and her teacher mentioned that she might be interested in the district's international studies track. She shows genuine curiosity about the places I used to work and the people I helped during my diplomatic years." So she's already demonstrating interest in exactly the kind of international opportunities that Victoria's offer might provide? Brian realized that Tom's questions were highlighting contradictions in his own reasoning that he'd been reluctant to examine. "Yes, she is." "Brian," Tom said carefully, "I hired you 3 years ago because you needed work that accommodated personal circumstances. I've been happy to have someone with your abilities on our maintenance staff, but I've also wondered whether airport janitorial work really serves your family's long-term interests as well as it addresses immediate needs." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Riley is 8 years old now, not an infant requiring constant parental presence. Her needs are evolving from requiring stability to requiring opportunities for growth and development. Maybe your professional choices should evolve accordingly." The observation hit Brian unexpectedly. He'd been so focused on maintaining the employment arrangement that had provided security during Riley's early childhood that he hadn't considered whether those same arrangements remained optimal for her current developmental stage. "You think I should accept Victoria's offer?" Tom shook his head. "I think you should seriously consider whether the choices that were necessary 3 years ago are still necessary today. I think you should evaluate Victoria's proposal based on Riley's current needs rather than the needs she had as a grieving 5-year-old. Brian found himself remembering Riley's recent questions about international travel, her excitement when he occasionally shared stories from his diplomatic career, and her expressed desire to help people understand each other across cultural differences. "She's been asking about visiting the places I used to work," Brian admitted, "and she wants to learn languages that would allow her to help people the way I sometimes help travelers at the airport." "Then maybe," Tom suggested gently, "limiting your professional opportunities also limits hers. Maybe the stability you've prioritized is becoming a constraint rather than a benefit. The conversation was revealing perspectives that Brian hadn't allowed himself to consider during 3 years of careful routine maintenance. His focus on protecting Riley from disruption might have evolved into protecting her from opportunities that could expand her understanding of the world. "Tom," Brian said slowly, "if I were to seriously explore Victoria's offer, would that create problems for airport staffing? I know my language assistance with international travelers has become part of our standard service offerings." Tom smiled with the expression of a supervisor who'd been anticipating this question. "Brian, we've been managing international travelers for 15 years before you arrived, and we'll manage them after you leave. What we can't manage is keeping someone with your abilities in a position that doesn't utilize them appropriately. It's not fair to you, and frankly, it's not fair to Riley." "You're encouraging me to consider leaving?" "I'm encouraging you to consider what kind of future you want to build for your family," Tom clarified. "Airport maintenance provides security, but it doesn't provide growth. Victoria's offer sounds like it might provide both." Brian realized that Tom's perspective was forcing him to confront assumptions about stability and risk that had shaped every decision since Sarah's death. He'd convinced himself that minimizing professional challenges would maximize family security. But perhaps that equation had become counterproductive as Riley's needs matured. "The compensation Victoria discussed would solve every financial concern that led me to choose airport maintenance originally. And the travel opportunities would expose Riley to international experiences that most children never access. But it would also mean leaving the predictable routine that has provided emotional security for both of us." "Brian," Tom said with the wisdom that came from decades of personnel management, "sometimes emotional security comes from growing into new possibilities rather than maintaining familiar limitations. Maybe it's time to find out whether you and Riley are ready for that kind of growth." As Brian prepared to leave Tom's office and complete his afternoon duties, he realized that the conversation had fundamentally altered his perspective on Victoria's offer. What had seemed like a risky departure from necessary stability now appeared to be a potential evolution towards opportunities that better serve Riley's developing interests and abilities. The maintenance cart waited in the hallway exactly where he'd left it, but Brian's relationship to those familiar tools and routines had been irrevocably changed. Whether he accepted Victoria's position or remained in airport maintenance, he could no longer view his current arrangement as simply providing stability. He would need to evaluate it as potentially limiting possibilities that Riley deserved to explore. Tomorrow evening's coffee conversation would determine whether those possibilities represented realistic opportunities or appealing fantasies. But today's discussions with both Victoria and Tom had convinced Brian that avoiding the question was no longer serving his family's best interests. For the first time in 3 years, Brian found himself genuinely excited about professional possibilities rather than simply grateful for employment security. The feeling was both exhilarating and terrifying, suggesting that perhaps Tom was right about the need to evolve beyond choices that had once been necessary but might now be constraining. Riley would be the ultimate judge of whether adventure was preferable to stability. But Brian was beginning to suspect that his 8-year-old daughter might be more ready for international opportunities than her protective father had been willing to acknowledge. The phone call came at 6:47 a.m. on Thursday morning, jolting Brian from the first peaceful sleep he'd experienced since Victoria's dramatic appearance at the airport. Riley's school nurse spoke with the practiced calm of someone delivering concerning news that required immediate parental attention. "Mr. Gome, this is Sarah Martinez from Riverside Elementary. Riley collapsed during morning assembly. She's conscious and stable, but we need you to come immediately. I've already called for an ambulance as a precautionary measure." Brian's blood turned cold as every parent's worst nightmare materialized through the phone speaker. "Collapsed? What do you mean collapsed? She was fine when I dropped her off this morning." "She fainted during the Pledge of Allegiance," Nurse Martinez explained carefully. "When she came to, she complained of dizziness and severe fatigue. Given her medical history with autoimmune complications, Dr. Peterson's office requested immediate hospital evaluation to rule out any serious developments." Medical history. the phrase that had shaped every major decision in Brian's life for the past 3 years. Riley's juvenile arthritis had been diagnosed when she was 6, requiring careful monitoring and expensive medications that their current insurance covered adequately. But autoimmune conditions could evolve unpredictably, developing complications that transformed manageable chronic illness into life-threatening crises. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, Brian said, already reaching for clothes while calculating the drive time to Riverside Elementary. "Don't let the ambulance leave without me." "Of course, Mr. Gome. Riley is asking for you, and she seems more worried about missing her math test than about the medical situation. She's a remarkably brave little girl." After ending the call, Brian moved through emergency routines that had become tragically familiar during Sarah's illness. Phone calls to cancel his airport shift, hurried explanations to Mrs. Patterson about the medical crisis, and the sick feeling of dread that accompanied any unexpected health development involving his daughter. The drive to Riley's school passed in a blur of worst-case scenarios and desperate calculations. Riley's condition had been stable for 18 months, with regular blood work showing normal inflammatory markers and no progression of joint involvement. But autoimmune diseases were notorious for sudden flares that could overwhelm previous treatment protocols without warning. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, Brian said, already reaching for clothes while calculating the drive time to Riverside Elementary. "Don't let the ambulance leave without me." "Of course, Mr. Gome. Riley is asking for you, and she seems more worried about missing her math test than about the medical situation. She's a remarkably brave little girl." After ending the call, Brian moved through emergency routines that had become tragically familiar during Sarah's illness. Phone calls to cancel his airport shift, hurried explanations to Mrs. Patterson about the medical crisis, and the sick feeling of dread that accompanied any unexpected health development involving his daughter. The drive to Riley's school passed in a blur of worst-case scenarios and desperate calculations. Riley's condition had been stable for 18 months, with regular blood work showing normal inflammatory markers and no progression of joint involvement. But autoimmune diseases were notorious for sudden flares that could overwhelm previous treatment protocols without warning. At the school, Brian found Riley sitting on a cot in the nurse's office, pale but alert, holding the small stuffed panda that served as her comfort object during medical situations. Her smile when she saw him was brave, but couldn't quite hide the fear in her 8-year-old eyes. "Hi, Daddy," she said with forced cheerfulness. "I got dizzy during the pledge and fell down. Everyone was really worried, but I feel better now. Can I still take my math test this afternoon?" Brian knelt beside the cot, checking Riley's forehead for fever while studying her complexion for signs of the autoimmune flares that had once required emergency hospitalizations. "We'll worry about math tests later, sweetheart. Right now, we need to make sure you're okay." The paramedics arrived with equipment that reminded Brian of Sarah's final months, monitors and medical bags that represented the intersection of hope and helplessness that characterized serious illness. Riley submitted to their evaluation with the cooperation of someone accustomed to medical procedures, answering questions about her symptoms with precision that broke Brian's heart. "Blood pressure is low but stable, heart rate slightly elevated. Given her autoimmune history, we recommend full evaluation at Oregon Health and Science University. Their pediatric rheumatology department can assess whether this represents disease progression or unrelated factors." Oregon Health and Science University, the same hospital where Sarah had received her final treatments, where Brian had learned that sometimes medical expertise wasn't enough to prevent devastating outcomes. The familiar drive through Portland's medical district would now carry Riley toward evaluations that could reshape their carefully maintained stability. During the ambulance ride, Riley's condition remained stable, but Brian's anxiety intensified as he calculated the potential implications of serious health complications. Their current insurance through the airport would cover basic treatment, but specialized autoimmune therapies often required pre-authorization battles and substantial co-payments that could strain their modest budget.
More significantly, any progression of Riley's condition might require treatment protocols available only at major medical centers, potentially necessitating relocation to cities with specialized pediatric facilities. The stability that had guided every choice for 3 years could be undermined by medical realities beyond their control. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the pediatric rheumatologist who had managed Riley's care since diagnosis, greeted them in the emergency department with the serious expression that preceded comprehensive medical evaluations. "Hello, Riley. I hear you had an exciting morning at school?" "I fell down during the Pledge of Allegiance," Riley reported matter-of-factly, "but I didn't hit my head or anything. I just got really dizzy and needed to sit down, except there wasn't a chair." Dr. Walsh smiled at Riley's practical description while reviewing the paramedic reports with the focused attention that characterized thorough medical assessment. "We're going to run some tests to make sure everything is working properly. Blood work, some x-rays, and maybe an ultrasound to check how your joints are doing." The next 4 hours passed in the institutional rhythm that Brian remembered too well from Sarah's hospitalizations. Waiting rooms with fluorescent lighting and medical magazines, periodic updates from nursing staff, and the particular anxiety that accompanied watching medical professionals evaluating someone you love for potentially serious complications. Riley tolerated the testing procedures with remarkable patience, engaging the technicians in conversations about their equipment while submitting to blood draws and imaging studies. Her resilience reminded Brian of Sarah's grace during her own medical battles, and the comparison made his chest tight with emotion.
"Mr. Gome," Dr. Walsh called him into her office after the tests were completed. "I have some results to discuss with you." Brian sat in the familiar chair across from Dr. Walsh's desk, preparing for news that could range from reassuring to catastrophic. Riley's test results were displayed on computer monitors that showed the complex data points used to evaluate autoimmune disease activity. "The good news," Dr. Walsh began, "is that Riley's inflammatory markers remain normal, and there's no evidence of disease progression or joint involvement. Her collapse this morning appears to be related to stress and fatigue rather than autoimmune complications." Brian felt relief flood through him with physical intensity. "So her arthritis isn't getting worse?" "Not based on today's evaluation," Dr. Walsh confirmed. "However, I am concerned about the stress factors that may have contributed to this morning's episode. Riley mentioned during her interview that there have been some significant changes in your family's routine recently." Brian realized that Riley had probably discussed the previous day's excitement about Victoria's visit and the upcoming coffee meeting that could reshape their entire lives. "We've been talking about some potential changes to our living situation, new opportunities that might involve travel and different work arrangements." "And how is Riley responding to these discussions?" "She seems excited about the possibilities," Brian replied honestly. "She's been asking questions about international travel and expressing interest in learning new languages. I thought she was adapting well to the idea of changes." Dr. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. 8-year-olds often show enthusiasm about exciting possibilities while simultaneously experiencing anxiety about leaving familiar routines. Riley may be more stressed about potential changes than she's expressing directly. The observation hit Brian with uncomfortable accuracy. He'd been so focused on evaluating Victoria's offer from practical and professional perspectives that he hadn't adequately considered whether Riley's excitement might be masking concerns about leaving the stability that had defined her entire conscious memory. "What do you recommend?" "Careful attention to stress management during any transition period," Dr. Walsh replied. "If you do decide to pursue significant changes, gradual implementation rather than dramatic upheaval. Riley's condition is stable, but autoimmune diseases can be affected by emotional stress as well as physical factors." Brian found himself thinking about Victoria's proposal for international travel and cultural opportunities that had seemed perfectly suited to Riley's interests and curiosity. But Dr. Walsh's concerns about stress management suggested that even positive changes could trigger medical complications if implemented too quickly or dramatically. "Dr. Walsh," Brian said carefully, "if we were considering relocation to a different state or international travel for extended periods, what kind of medical considerations would be involved?"
Riley's condition can be managed anywhere with adequate pediatric rheumatology services, Dr. Walsh replied. But establishing care with new specialists takes time, and interrupting established treatment relationships should be done thoughtfully. Major life changes require medical planning as well as logistical planning. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Brian realized that the morning's medical crisis had added complexity to decision-making that had already felt overwhelming. Riley's health scare served as a reminder that their current stability included medical relationships and treatment protocols that couldn't be casually abandoned for professional opportunities. "Daddy," Riley said as they walked toward the parking garage, "am I going to be okay? The tests weren't scary, but all the doctors seemed really serious." "You're going to be fine, sweetheart," Brian assured her, though Dr. Walsh's concerns about stress-related health impacts were echoing in his mind. "Dr. Walsh said your tests looked good, and you don't have to worry about your arthritis getting worse." "Good," Riley replied with visible relief, "because I want to be healthy enough for our coffee meeting tonight. I've been thinking about questions to ask the lady about her job and whether living in different places would be fun or scary." Brian felt his chest tighten again as he realized that Riley had been carrying anxiety about their evening conversation with Victoria, despite her outward enthusiasm about international opportunities. Her medical episode might have been triggered by stress about changes that she wanted to embrace but feared might disrupt the security she'd always known. "Riley," Brian said gently, "you know that any decisions about changes to our life will be made together, right? We won't do anything that doesn't feel right for both of us." "I know," Riley replied. "But what if the changes are good for you but scary for me? Or what if they're exciting for me but too risky for you? How do we decide what's best for our family?" The question revealed wisdom beyond Riley's 8 years and highlighted the complexity of balancing individual needs with family decisions. Brian realized that tonight's conversation with Victoria would need to address not only professional logistics and compensation packages, but also the emotional and medical factors that affected Riley's ability to handle significant life changes. As they drove home from the hospital, Brian found himself questioning whether pursuing Victoria's offer represented responsible evaluation of new opportunities or selfish pursuit of professional fulfillment that could jeopardize Riley's health and stability. The morning's medical crisis had transformed tonight's coffee meeting from an exciting exploration of possibilities into a careful evaluation of risks that extended far beyond career considerations. Riley's well-being would need to be the primary factor in any decision, regardless of how appealing Victoria's proposal might appear from professional or financial perspectives. But understanding Riley's true feelings about potential changes would require conversations that went deeper than her initial enthusiasm about international travel and language learning. The hospital visit had revealed that even positive changes could trigger stress responses that affect her physical health as well as emotional well-being.
Tonight's discussion would determine whether Victoria's offer represented an opportunity that could benefit their entire family or a risk that could undermine the medical and emotional stability that had taken 3 years to establish. By 4:30 p.m., Brian sat at his kitchen table staring at Victoria's business card while Riley napped on the living room couch, exhausted from the morning's medical ordeal. The afternoon had passed in a haze of phone calls to the school explaining Riley's absence, conversations with Mrs. Patterson about the hospital visit, and the kind of parental anxiety that made normal activities feel impossible. The coffee meeting with Victoria was scheduled for 6 p.m., but Brian found himself questioning whether pursuing the conversation was responsible given Riley's stress-related medical episode. Dr. Walsh's warnings about gradual transitions and stress management echoed in his mind, competing with Tom Rodriguez's encouragement about evolving beyond choices that might now be constraining rather than protective. Brian's phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. "Looking forward to our conversation this evening. I hope Riley is feeling better after her school day. See you at 6. The considerate inquiry about Riley's well-being reminded Brian that Victoria didn't know about the medical crisis that had transformed his perspective on tonight's discussion. She was expecting to meet with someone enthusiastic about international opportunities, not someone grappling with evidence that even the prospect of change could trigger health complications in his daughter. Riley stirred on the couch, opening her eyes with the disoriented expression of someone waking from unexpected afternoon sleep. "Daddy, what time is it? Did I miss anything important?" "It's almost 5 o'clock, sweetheart," Brian replied, moving to sit beside her on the couch. "You've been sleeping for about 2 hours. How are you feeling?" "Better," Riley said, sitting up slowly and checking her arms for any lingering soreness from the morning's blood draws. "The hospital made me tired, but I don't feel dizzy anymore. Are we still having coffee with the lady from your work?" Brian studied his daughter's face, searching for signs of continued fatigue or anxiety that might indicate she wasn't ready for potentially stressful conversations about major life changes. "We can postpone the meeting if you're not feeling up to it. Victoria would understand if we needed to reschedule." "No!" Riley's response was immediate and emphatic. "I want to meet her. I've been thinking about questions to ask, and I want to know more about the places you used to work. Dr. Walsh said I fainted because I was worried about changes, but maybe talking about them will make me less worried." Riley's 8-year-old logic was surprisingly sophisticated, but Brian remained concerned about whether evening discussions of international relocation represented appropriate stress management for someone who just experienced a medical episode triggered by anxiety about change. "Riley," Brian said gently, "what exactly are you worried about regarding potential changes to our life?" Riley was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness she brought to important topics. "I'm worried that if we move somewhere else, I won't be able to see Mrs. Patterson anymore. And I'm worried that if you get a really important job, you might be too busy to help with my homework or come to my school concerts. And I'm worried," she continued, her voice becoming smaller, "that if we go to places where people speak different languages, I might not be able to make friends or understand what's happening around me." Brian felt his chest tighten as he realized that Riley's anxieties were entirely reasonable responses to the uncertainties inherent in major life transitions. Her concerns weren't irrational fears that could be dismissed with reassurance. They were legitimate questions about practical realities that any relocation would involve. "Those are very thoughtful worries," Brian acknowledged, "and they're exactly the kind of things we need to discuss with Victoria if we're going to consider her offer seriously." "But what if discussing them makes you decide that the changes are too risky?" Riley asked, with the perceptive concern that characterized her approach to adult decision-making. "What if my worries mean you can't take a job that would make you happy?" The question revealed the impossible position that Riley felt caught in, wanting to support her father's professional fulfillment while simultaneously needing reassurance about her own security and well-being. Brian realized that tonight's conversation would need to address not only logistical considerations, but also the emotional burden Riley felt about potentially limiting his opportunities. "Sweetheart," Brian said carefully, "my happiness depends much more on your well-being than on any particular job. If Victoria's offer doesn't work for our family, then it's not the right opportunity, regardless of how appealing it might seem professionally." "But you've been cleaning floors for 3 years," Riley pointed out with devastating accuracy. "Mrs. Patterson says you're too smart for that job, and I know you miss using your Chinese language skills for important things. Maybe I should be braver about trying new places." Brian felt overwhelmed by the maturity Riley was demonstrating and the unfair responsibility she felt for her career limitations. The phone rang, interrupting their conversation with the sharp urgency that always made Brian's heart race since Sarah's illness. The caller ID showed Dr. Walsh's office number, and Brian answered with the immediate tension that characterized responses to unexpected medical communications. "Mr. Gome, this is Dr. Walsh. I wanted to follow up on Riley's test results and discuss some additional considerations that occurred to me after your visit." "Is something wrong with her results?" Brian asked, immediately moving into the hypervigilant state that had become second nature during medical crises.
"No, her lab work remains completely normal," Dr. Walsh assured him quickly. "But I've been thinking about our conversation regarding potential relocation and life changes.
I realized I should have asked more specific questions about the timeline and nature of the opportunities you're considering. Brian explained Victoria's proposal in general terms, describing the international consulting work, family-inclusive benefits, and accommodation for Riley's educational and medical needs. As he spoke, Dr. Walsh asked clarifying questions that demonstrated thorough understanding of both the opportunities and the challenges involved. "Mr. Gome," Dr. Walsh said after hearing the details, "I want to be very clear about something. Riley's medical condition shouldn't prevent your family from pursuing opportunities that could enhance both your professional fulfillment and her educational experiences. However, any major transition needs to be managed carefully to minimize stress-related complications." "What does that mean practically?" Brian asked. "It means gradual implementation rather than dramatic upheaval," Dr. Walsh explained. "If you decide to accept this position, consider beginning with remote work while maintaining your current living situation. Test Riley's comfort level with travel through short trips before committing to extended international stays. Establish relationships with pediatric specialists in any new location before you actually need them." The advice was simultaneously encouraging and daunting. Dr. Walsh was confirming that Victoria's offer didn't need to be automatically rejected due to medical concerns, but she was also highlighting the complexity involved in managing Riley's health during major life transitions. "There's something else," Dr. Walsh continued. "Riley mentioned during her interview today that she's excited about learning new languages and visiting places where different cultures intersect. That enthusiasm suggests resilience and adaptability that could serve her well during international experiences. But this morning's episode suggests that she's also anxious about those same possibilities," Brian pointed out. "Anxiety and excitement often coexist when we're contemplating significant changes," Dr. Walsh replied. "The key is ensuring that the excitement remains stronger than the anxiety, and that Riley feels empowered to communicate her concerns rather than suppressing them." After ending the call with Dr. Walsh, Brian found Riley sitting quietly on the couch, clearly having overheard most of the medical consultation. Her expression showed the thoughtful concentration she displayed when processing complex information that affected her life. "Daddy," Riley said slowly, "Dr. Walsh thinks I could handle living in different places if we did it carefully, right?" "That's what she said. But the decision isn't just about whether you could handle it. It's about whether it would make our family happier and more fulfilled than staying where we are." "What do you think would make us happier?" Riley asked, with the directness that always surprised Brian with its insight. Brian realized that he didn't have a clear answer to Riley's question. For 3 years, he'd equated happiness with stability and security, believing that minimizing uncertainty would maximize their family's well-being. But today's events had forced him to confront the possibility that excessive focus on security might be limiting opportunities for growth and fulfillment. "I think," Brian said carefully, "that we need to ask Victoria some very specific questions about how her proposal would work in practice, not just the exciting parts about international travel and interesting work, but the practical details about medical care, education, housing, and maintaining relationships with Mrs. Patterson, who've become important to our family." "And if the practical details seem workable," Pross asked, "then we'll need to decide whether we're brave enough to try something that could be wonderful, but might also be challenging," Brian replied honestly. As 5:30 p.m. approached, Brian found himself in the impossible position of needing to make decisions about professional opportunities while managing medical anxieties, parental responsibilities, and his own deep uncertainty about whether prioritizing security or embracing possibility better served his family's long-term interests. Riley's medical episode had demonstrated that change itself could be stressful enough to trigger physical symptoms, but Dr. Walsh's follow-up call had confirmed that medical considerations didn't necessarily preclude international opportunities if they were managed thoughtfully.
The question remaining was whether Brian possessed the courage to explore possibilities that felt simultaneously appealing and terrifying, and whether Riley's resilience was sufficient to handle transitions that would test both her adaptability and her father's faith in their ability to build fulfilling lives outside the carefully protected boundaries they'd maintained for 3 years. At 5:45 p.m., Brian helped Riley put on her jacket and gathered the list of questions they'd prepared for Victoria. Whether tonight's conversation would lead to life-changing decisions or careful rejection of appealing but impractical opportunities remained unclear. But Brian understood that avoiding the discussion entirely would represent its own kind of choice. A choice to prioritize fear over curiosity, limitation over possibility, and protection over growth. Riley deserved a father who was brave enough to explore opportunities that might expand rather than constrain her understanding of what their future could hold. The drive to Riverside Cafe would determine whether they possessed the courage to discover what lay beyond the carefully maintained boundaries of their current life. Victoria Zhang stood in her corner office at Nexus Dynamics, headquartered in Seattle, staring out at Elliott Bay while reviewing the comprehensive research her assistant had compiled about Brian Gome. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her desk, where 3 separate folders contained information that painted a picture of extraordinary talent constrained by circumstances that most corporate executives would never encounter. The first folder held Brian's professional history, 7 years of State Department service with diplomatic assignments that had facilitated over $2 billion in successful trade agreements between the United States and China. His performance evaluations described him as exceptional at cultural bridge building and invaluable for complex negotiations requiring deep understanding of Chinese business protocols. Letters of recommendation from embassy colleagues characterized him as someone who possessed a rare combination of linguistic precision and diplomatic intuition. The second folder contained personal information that explained the 3-year gap in Brian's diplomatic career, medical bills totaling over $200,000 for his wife's cancer treatment, life insurance policies that had been insufficient to cover experimental therapies, and the timeline that showed his resignation from the State Department coinciding with Sarah Gome's final hospitalization. Bank records indicated the systematic liquidation of savings, retirement accounts, and educational funds that had been accumulated during years of diplomatic service. The third folder held information about Riley's medical condition, educational performance, and the carefully structured life that Brian had built around single parenting responsibilities. School records showed a bright, curious child who excelled academically while managing a chronic condition that required ongoing medical monitoring. Teacher evaluations described Riley as resilient and adaptable, with exceptional interest in international cultures and languages. Victoria closed the folders and walked to her window, processing implications that extended far beyond the business crisis that had brought them together. Brian Gome wasn't simply an overqualified airport employee who happened to speak excellent Mandarin. He was a former diplomatic professional whose expertise had been sidelined by personal tragedy and economic necessity, but whose abilities remained exactly what Nexus Dynamics needed for successful China market expansion. More significantly, his current employment situation represented massive underutilization of talent that could benefit not only her company but the broader community of American businesses struggling to navigate Chinese commercial relationships. Brian's diplomatic background and cultural expertise were rare resources being wasted on maintenance duties because personal circumstances had forced impossible choices between professional fulfillment and family responsibility. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from her Beijing office. Chairman Liu's team has specifically requested Mr. Gome's participation in next week's partnership discussions. They were impressed by his cultural sensitivity and diplomatic protocols. Can we arrange his involvement? The request confirmed what Victoria had suspected. Brian's intervention in yesterday's merger crisis had created professional visibility that extended beyond emergency assistance. Chairman Liu's specific interest in ongoing collaboration meant that Brian's diplomatic expertise had been recognized at the highest levels of Chinese business leadership, generating opportunities that could reshape his career trajectory regardless of Nexus Dynamics' employment offer. Victoria realized that tonight's coffee meeting wasn't simply about recruiting talented personnel for her company's needs. It was about recognizing exceptional abilities that deserved platforms worthy of their impact, and about ensuring that personal circumstances didn't permanently constrain professional potential that could benefit international business relationships on a significant scale. Her assistant knocked on the office door, interrupting her thoughts with the afternoon's final briefing. "Ms. Zhang, I have updates on the logistics you requested for tonight's meeting with Mr. Gome. What did you discover about family-friendly employment arrangements for diplomatic professionals?" "Several interesting precedents," her assistant replied, consulting notes from conversations with human resources specialists who managed international personnel. "The World Bank offers remote consultation positions for former diplomatic staff with family obligations. The Asia Society has created flexible arrangements for cultural liaison work that accommodates single parenting responsibilities. And 3 major consulting firms have developed hybrid models that provide international expertise without requiring traditional travel demands." Meaning that what I'm proposing for Brian isn't unprecedented? Meaning that what you're proposing represents best practices for retaining exceptional talent that might otherwise be lost due to personal circumstances, her assistant clarified. "The research suggests that companies willing to accommodate family obligations often gain access to abilities that wouldn't be available through traditional employment arrangements." Victoria nodded, feeling confirmed in her assessment that Brian's situation represented opportunity rather than liability from a business perspective. What about the medical considerations for families with chronic health conditions? International health insurance for employees with dependents can cover specialized care anywhere in the world. Several firms specifically recruit talent with family medical needs because comprehensive benefits packages allow them to access expertise that other companies can't retain. And educational opportunities for children of international consultants? Extensive programs exist for globally mobile families. International schools, cultural immersion experiences, and educational support that turns frequent travel into learning opportunities rather than disruptions. Many children of diplomatic families report that international exposure significantly enhanced their college applications and career preparation. Victoria realized that every practical concern that might prevent Brian from accepting international consulting work had been addressed by companies that understood the value of accommodating exceptional talent with complex personal circumstances. The infrastructure existed to support exactly the kind of arrangement she was prepared to offer. "There's one more factor," her assistant added carefully. "I researched Mr. Gome's wife's medical situation and discovered that her treatment costs exceeded what would have been manageable with comprehensive international health coverage. The financial pressures that led to his career change might have been preventable with different employment benefits." The observation hit Victoria with uncomfortable force. Brian's current situation wasn't simply the result of tragic illness, but of inadequate support systems that had forced impossible choices between family care and professional continuity. Better employment benefits might have allowed him to maintain his diplomatic career while managing his wife's medical needs, preventing the 3-year professional hiatus that had led to airport maintenance work. Victoria walked back to her desk and pulled out the employment proposal she'd been developing since yesterday's airport encounter. The compensation package reflected not only Brian's current market value as a China specialist, but also acknowledgement of the professional setback he'd experienced due to circumstances beyond his control. The benefit structure was designed to ensure that medical crises would never again force choices between family care and career continuity. "Schedule a call with Chairman Liu's office for first thing tomorrow morning," Victoria instructed her assistant. "I want to discuss their specific interest in ongoing collaboration with Mr. Gome and explore opportunities that might extend beyond Nexus Dynamics' immediate consulting needs." "Are you considering facilitating Mr. Gome's professional development with other organizations as well as your own company?" Victoria paused, recognizing that her assistant's question highlighted the broader implications of tonight's conversation.
I'm considering whether my responsibility extends beyond recruiting talent for our company's benefit to ensuring that exceptional abilities find appropriate platforms regardless of where those platforms might be located. That's unusually altruistic for corporate recruitment, her assistant observed. That's recognition that some talents are too valuable to remain constrained by circumstances that don't reflect their capabilities, Victoria replied. Brian Gome's expertise could benefit multiple organizations and international relationships. Limiting that impact to our company's immediate needs would be short-sighted. As 5:30 p.m. approached, Victoria gathered the materials she'd prepared for the evening's discussion. Detailed employment proposals, information about international family support services, and preliminary communications from Chairman Liu's office about ongoing collaboration opportunities. But she also carried questions that extended beyond business logistics to more fundamental considerations about professional opportunity and personal responsibility. Tonight's conversation would determine whether Brian was ready to reclaim the diplomatic career that circumstances had interrupted, and whether his family situation could accommodate international opportunities that would utilize his abilities at their full potential. But Victoria understood that the discussion would also reveal whether her company was prepared to invest in talent retention models that prioritized family stability alongside professional development. The research her assistant had compiled demonstrated that accommodating exceptional talent with complex personal circumstances wasn't simply a charitable gesture. It was strategic business practice that allowed access to expertise unavailable through traditional recruitment channels. Brian's diplomatic background and cultural fluency represented exactly the kind of specialized knowledge that companies struggled to develop internally or purchase through consulting contracts. More importantly, his personal circumstances had created perspective on work-life balance that could benefit organizational culture, while his professional expertise addressed technical business challenges. Employees who had navigated significant personal adversity often brought resilience, empathy, and problem-solving capabilities that enhanced team dynamics as well as individual performance. Victoria checked the time and gathered her materials for the drive to Beaverton. Tonight's meeting would reveal whether the theoretical framework for accommodating exceptional talent could translate into practical arrangements that worked for families with real medical needs, educational priorities, and emotional attachments to established communities. The conversation would also determine whether Brian possessed the courage to embrace opportunities that required leaving carefully constructed security for possibilities that promised fulfillment but couldn't guarantee predictability. Victoria suspected that his diplomatic background had prepared him for exactly this kind of calculated risk assessment. But 3 years of prioritizing stability over opportunity had fundamentally altered his relationship to professional uncertainty. As she drove toward Riverside Cafe, Victoria found herself thinking about the broader implications of talent recognition and opportunity creation. How many other exceptional professionals were constrained by circumstances that prevented them from utilizing abilities that could benefit multiple organizations and communities? How often did personal adversity create professional limitations that represented losses not only for individuals but for the broader networks that could benefit from their expertise? Tonight's conversation with Brian and Riley would explore whether those losses were inevitable or whether creative employment arrangements could transform personal challenges into professional opportunities that served family needs while addressing business requirements. The outcome would determine not only Brian's career trajectory, but Victoria's understanding of corporate responsibility for recognizing and nurturing talent that existed outside traditional professional pathways. Riverside Cafe buzzed with the comfortable energy of families enjoying early evening dinner, but Brian barely noticed the familiar atmosphere as he and Riley settled into a corner booth that provided privacy for what could be a life-changing conversation. Riley sat beside him with the serious expression she wore during important discussions, her small notebook open to the questions they'd prepared during the drive from their apartment. Victoria arrived precisely at 6 p.m., but instead of the business attire Brian had expected, she wore casual jeans and a sweater that made her seem more approachable than the corporate executive who'd managed billion-dollar merger crises. She carried a leather portfolio and what appeared to be a wrapped gift, both of which she placed carefully on the table before extending her hand to Riley with genuine warmth.
"You must be Riley," Victoria said with a smile that immediately put the 8-year-old at ease. "I'm Victoria Zhang. Your father helped me solve a very important problem yesterday, and I wanted to thank both of you for his assistance." "He's really good at helping people with language problems," Riley replied seriously. "Sometimes travelers at the airport get confused, and Dad can talk to them in Chinese or French or Spanish. I want to learn how to do that too." Victoria's expression showed genuine interest rather than polite adult conversation to child conversation. "What languages are you most curious about learning?"
Mandarin, definitely, Riley said without hesitation. Dad has been teaching me some phrases, but I want to be fluent enough to help people have real conversations. And maybe Japanese, because anime is popular at school, and I think it would be cool to understand what the characters are actually saying. Brian watched Victoria's face as she processed Riley's linguistic ambitions, noting that her smile became more genuine as she recognized his daughter's authentic curiosity about international communication. The conversation was developing naturally rather than feeling like a formal interview, which helped his anxiety about exposing Riley to professional pressures she might not be ready to handle. "Riley," Victoria said, pulling the wrapped gift toward her, "I brought something I thought you might find interesting." She handed over a package that revealed itself to be a beautifully illustrated children's book about Chinese culture, written in both English and simplified Mandarin characters. Riley's eyes widened with delight as she examined the book's colorful pages, showing traditional festivals, calligraphy demonstrations, and children from different regions of China engaged in cultural activities. "This is amazing! Dad, look at the characters! I can read some of these already because of what you've been teaching me." Victoria watched Riley's enthusiasm with obvious pleasure before turning her attention to Brian. "I hope you don't mind that I brought a small gift. I wanted Riley to know that our conversation includes her interests and perspectives, not just adult employment discussions." "That was very thoughtful," Brian replied, touched by Victoria's consideration for Riley's feelings during what could have been an exclusively adult conversation. "We've both been looking forward to learning more about your company and the opportunities you mentioned." Victoria opened her portfolio and spread several documents across the table with the organized efficiency that characterized successful executives. But instead of launching into corporate presentations, she began with personal questions that demonstrated genuine interest in understanding their family situation. "Brian mentioned that you've both been discussing potential changes to your living situation," Victoria said, addressing Riley directly. "How do you feel about the possibility of traveling to different places and meeting people from other cultures?" Riley considered the question with the seriousness she brought to important topics. "I think it would be exciting, but also maybe a little scary. I've never lived anywhere except Oregon, and I worry about leaving Mrs. Patterson and my friends at school. But I also think it would be amazing to see the places Dad used to work and learn about different ways people live." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "Those are very reasonable concerns. Change can be exciting and scary at the same time, and it's important to talk about both feelings." She turned to Brian. "What about you? What aspects of international consulting work appeal to you, and what concerns do you have about returning to that field?" Brian appreciated that Victoria was addressing both practical and emotional factors rather than focusing exclusively on professional logistics. "The opportunity to use my language skills and diplomatic experience for meaningful work is incredibly appealing," he admitted. "But I'm concerned about maintaining the stability that Riley needs, especially given her medical condition and the routine that has served our family well for 3 years." "Let's talk about those concerns specifically," Victoria said, pulling out a detailed document that Brian recognized as a comprehensive employment proposal. "Because I believe most of the practical obstacles can be addressed through careful planning and appropriate support systems." What Victoria presented over the next 30 minutes exceeded even Brian's most optimistic expectations about what corporate accommodation might look like. The employment package included not only competitive compensation that would solve their immediate financial pressures, but also benefits designed specifically for families with complex medical and educational needs. International health coverage through our executive benefits program would provide Riley access to pediatric specialists anywhere in the world, Victoria explained, showing them documentation from major medical centers in Beijing, Shanghai, London, and Seattle.
Dr. Jennifer Walsh has already confirmed that Riley's condition can be managed effectively with proper specialist care, regardless of geographic location. Riley looked up from her Chinese culture book with obvious interest. Would I be able to see doctors who speak different languages? That sounds kinda cool. Many of the pediatric specialists our company works with are multilingual, Victoria confirmed, and having a father who speaks Mandarin fluently would make medical care in China or other Asian countries much easier than most families could manage. Victoria continued outlining educational opportunities that turned frequent travel into learning experiences rather than disruptions. International schools in major cities often provide better language education than most American school districts can offer. Riley could become fluent in Mandarin and Japanese while experiencing the cultures that shaped those languages. But what about my friends here? Riley asked, voicing the concern that had been worrying her most. Victoria's smile showed that she'd anticipated this question. That's why we're proposing a gradual transition rather than immediate relocation. Your father would begin with remote consultation work while maintaining your current living situation. We'd test international travel through short trips that include educational opportunities for you, and Mrs. Patterson would always be welcome to visit wherever you end up living. Brian found himself genuinely moved by the thoroughness of Victoria's planning and her obvious consideration for Riley's emotional needs alongside practical logistics. You've put remarkable thought into accommodating our family situation. I've put thought into recognizing exceptional talent and creating opportunities for it to flourish, Victoria corrected gently. What you demonstrated yesterday wasn't just language assistance, it was diplomatic expertise that my company desperately needs and that the broader business community would benefit from accessing.
Victoria pulled out her phone and showed the messages from Chairman Liu's office. This morning, Longteng Electronics specifically requested your participation in next week's partnership discussions. They were impressed by your cultural sensitivity and want ongoing collaboration. That level of recognition from Chinese business leadership creates opportunities that extend far beyond any single employment arrangement. Riley looked between her father and Victoria with the focused attention she gave to adult conversations that might affect her life.
So Dad wouldn't just be helping your company, he'd be helping lots of companies understand Chinese business culture?
Exactly, Victoria confirmed. Your father possesses expertise that could facilitate millions of dollars in successful international partnerships. The question is whether we can create employment arrangements that allow him to use those abilities while maintaining the family stability you both need. Brian felt the familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety that had once characterized his diplomatic career's most significant opportunities. Victoria's proposal addressed every practical concern he'd raised while offering professional fulfillment that had seemed impossible to achieve given his family responsibilities. There's one more factor, Victoria added, her tone becoming more serious. The research I've conducted suggests that your current employment situation, while providing stability, may actually be limiting Riley's opportunities rather than protecting them. Children of international professionals often develop language skills, cultural awareness, and global perspectives that serve them well throughout their lives. Riley had been listening intently to the adult conversation, and now she looked at her father with an expression that mixed hope and concern.
Dad, would taking this job make you happy? Like really happy, not just okay with your situation happy.
The question, delivered with 8-year-old directness, cut to the heart of decisions Brian had been avoiding for 3 years. Riley's perceptive inquiry forced him to confront whether his focus on stability had become a limitation rather than a protection for both their futures. Yes, Brian admitted quietly, this kind of work would make me genuinely happy in ways I haven't experienced since before your mother died. But my happiness isn't worth risking your well-being or security.
What if it didn't have to be a choice between your happiness and my security?
Riley asked with wisdom that surprised both adults. What if doing work that makes you happy actually makes our family stronger and gives me opportunities to learn things I can't learn in regular school? Victoria watched this exchange with obvious emotion, recognizing that Riley was articulating the possibility that Victoria had been hoping to create, professional fulfillment that enhanced rather than compromised family well-being.
Riley, Victoria said gently, what would you need to feel comfortable about trying these changes? what would make international opportunities feel exciting rather than scary?
Riley considered the question seriously before answering. I'd need to know that we could come back to Oregon if things didn't work out. I'd need to stay in touch with Mrs. Patterson and my friends here. And I'd need Dad to promise that he wouldn't get so busy with important work that he forgets about helping with homework and bedtime stories. Brian felt his chest tighten with emotion as he realized that Riley's conditions were entirely reasonable, and that Victoria's proposal could accommodate all of them. His daughter wasn't asking him to choose between professional fulfillment and family responsibility. She was asking him to find ways to honor both. Those conditions are completely reasonable, Victoria said, pulling out additional documents that outlined transition timelines and family support services. And they're exactly the kind of careful implementation that makes international career changes successful rather than disruptive. As Victoria outlined specific next steps, remote work trials, short-term travel experiences, and gradual transition timelines, Brian found himself genuinely believing that the life he'd once thought impossible might actually be achievable through careful planning and comprehensive support systems. For the first time in 3 years, Brian allowed himself to imagine a future where professional fulfillment and family stability weren't mutually exclusive, where Riley's education could include international experiences that expanded her worldview, and where their family's next chapter could be written in multiple languages across multiple continents. The question remaining was whether he possessed the courage to embrace possibilities that required leaving the carefully protected boundaries they'd maintained since Sarah's death, and trusting that growth could coexist with security in ways he'd never dared to hope. The documents spread across the Riverside Cafe table represented more than an employment opportunity. They represented a complete reimagining of the life Brian had carefully constructed since Sarah's death. As Victoria finished outlining the transition timeline and comprehensive support systems, the reality of the decision settled over the table like a weight that demanded immediate attention. "I need to be completely honest with you," Brian said, looking between Victoria and Riley with the seriousness that preceded life-altering choices. "This morning, Riley had a medical episode at school that was related to stress about potential changes to our life. Dr. Walsh confirmed that her arthritis isn't progressing, but the anxiety about leaving familiar routines was significant enough to cause physical symptoms." Victoria's expression immediately shifted to concern. "Is she okay now? Should we postpone this discussion until she's had more time to process the possibilities?"
"I'm fine,"
Riley interjected with the determination that characterized her approach to adult conversations. "Dr. Walsh said I fainted because I was worried about changes, but talking about them might actually help me worry less. I want to know exactly what would happen if we decide to try this." Brian appreciated Riley's directness, but he also felt the weight of parental responsibility for ensuring that any decision prioritized her well-being over professional ambitions. "The medical episode reminded me that even positive changes can be stressful for children, especially children who've already experienced significant loss and upheaval."
That's exactly why our implementation plan emphasizes gradual transition and family support, Victoria replied, pulling out additional documentation that addressed medical considerations for internationally mobile families. "I've researched pediatric specialists who work with diplomatic families, and they've developed protocols specifically for managing chronic conditions during international relocations." Riley leaned forward with obvious interest. "So there are other kids who move to different countries for their parents' work, and they have medical problems like mine?" "Many children of international professionals manage chronic conditions while living in multiple countries. The infrastructure exists to support exactly your situation, because companies have learned that exceptional talent often comes with family complexities that require accommodation rather than avoidance." Brian found himself studying the medical support documentation with the analytical approach that had once served him well in diplomatic negotiations. The coverage was comprehensive, the specialist networks were legitimate, and the protocols for managing chronic conditions during international assignments were more thorough than what they currently accessed through airport maintenance benefits. "But there's still the question of whether we're emotionally ready for this kind of change," Brian said carefully.
3 years of prioritizing stability and routine have created a comfort zone that serves our family well. Leaving that security for opportunities that require constant adaptation and uncertainty represents a fundamental shift in how we approach life decisions. "Dad," Riley said with the perceptive insight that always surprised Brian with its maturity, "maybe being too comfortable isn't always good for us. Maybe we need some uncertainty to grow and learn new things." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. Riley raises an important point. Research on child development suggests that appropriate challenges and new experiences often enhance resilience rather than undermining it. The key is ensuring that changes are supported rather than overwhelming. Brian looked around the familiar cafe where they'd shared countless quiet dinners during the past 3 years, recognizing that this location had become a symbol of the predictable life he'd built around single parenting responsibilities. The thought of replacing Tuesday evening dinners at Riverside Cafe with international travel and diplomatic receptions felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "Let me ask you both a direct question," Brian said, addressing Riley and Victoria equally. "If we tried this arrangement and discovered after 6 months that it wasn't working for our family, what would our options be? Could we return to something similar to our current situation without having burned bridges or created irreversible complications?" Victoria's response was immediate and reassuring. The initial contract includes a 6-month evaluation period with exit clauses that protect both parties. If the arrangement doesn't work for your family, you'd have time to identify alternative employment while maintaining health benefits and transition support. We're not asking you to make irreversible commitments based on theoretical benefits. And Tom Rodriguez has already indicated that airport maintenance positions would be available if I decided to return to that work, Brian added, thinking about his supervisor's encouragement to explore opportunities that utilized his abilities more fully. Riley had been quietly examining Victoria's employment documents, and now she looked up with a question that demonstrated her understanding of the decision's broader implications. "Victoria, if Dad doesn't take this job, will your company still be okay? Will Chairman Liu still want to work with American businesses?" The question revealed Riley's concern that declining the opportunity might have negative consequences for others, adding another layer of complexity to decision-making that was already challenging enough. Victoria's smile showed appreciation for Riley's thoughtfulness about impacts beyond their immediate family. "My company will be fine regardless of your father's decision," Victoria assured her. "But we would miss the opportunity to work with someone who has exactly the expertise we need. And Chairman Liu's interest in your father's diplomatic abilities means that other opportunities would likely emerge whether or not he accepts our specific offer." Brian realized that Victoria's honesty about external opportunities actually increased the pressure to make a decision, rather than reducing it. If Chairman Liu's interest could generate multiple offers from different organizations, declining Victoria's proposal wouldn't eliminate the question of whether to return to international consulting. It would simply delay the decision while potentially sacrificing the comprehensive family support that her offer particularly appealed. "There's something else we need to discuss," Brian said, his tone becoming more serious. "If I accept this position, Riley would be exposed to professional pressures and public visibility that she's never experienced. Diplomatic families often live in environments where personal privacy is limited, and where children must navigate cultural expectations that can be demanding for adults, let alone 8-year-olds. "That's a valid concern," Victoria acknowledged, "but it's also an opportunity for Riley to develop cultural competence and international awareness that could serve her well throughout her life. Many children of diplomatic professionals report that early international experience enhanced their college applications, career opportunities, and personal confidence." Riley had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention she brought to important adult conversations. And now she asked a question that surprised both Victoria and Brian with its sophistication. "If I learn to speak Mandarin fluently and understand Chinese culture, would that help me get into good colleges and maybe help other families like us someday?" The question revealed that Riley was thinking about their decision not just in terms of immediate adventure, but in terms of long-term educational and career benefits. Her perspective suggested a level of maturity and forward thinking that Brian hadn't fully appreciated during years of careful routine maintenance.
Yes, Victoria replied seriously. Fluent Mandarin and authentic cultural experience would make you extremely competitive for college admission and would prepare you for international careers that are becoming increasingly important in business, diplomacy, and education. Brian found himself calculating not just the immediate benefits and risks of Victoria's offer, but the long-term implications for Riley's educational and professional development. 3 years of prioritizing stability had provided security during her early childhood, but continuing that approach might actually limit opportunities that could shape her adult success. "Victoria," Brian said slowly, "I want to accept your offer. The work appeals to me professionally, the compensation solves our financial concerns, and the benefits address every practical worry I've had about Riley's medical and educational needs. But I need to make this decision with Riley's full understanding and enthusiastic consent, not just her willingness to accommodate my professional ambitions." Riley looked between her father and Victoria with the serious expression she wore during important moments. "Dad, I think we should try it. I'm scared about leaving Mrs. Patterson and my friends, but I'm also excited about learning languages and seeing the places you used to work. And if it doesn't work out, we can come back home." "Are you sure?" Brian pressed gently. "This would mean leaving everything familiar for opportunities that might be wonderful but could also be challenging in ways we can't predict." "I'm sure that I want you to be happy," Riley replied with devastating honesty. "And I'm sure that staying safe forever might mean missing out on amazing experiences. Mrs. Patterson always says that the best adventures happen when you're brave enough to try new things." Victoria watched this exchange with obvious emotion, recognizing that she was witnessing the kind of family conversation that could reshape multiple lives. "If you're both ready to move forward, I'd like to propose specific next steps that honor Riley's need for gradual transition while addressing the immediate opportunities that Chairman Liu's interest has created." Brian looked at his daughter's hopeful expression and felt the familiar mixture of protectiveness and pride that characterized his most important parenting moments. Riley's wisdom and courage were pushing him toward possibilities that his own caution might have prevented him from exploring. "What are the specific next steps?" Brian asked, understanding that this question represented his commitment to seriously pursuing Victoria's offer, rather than simply considering it as an interesting but impractical possibility. Victoria smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had been hoping for exactly this response. 2 weeks of remote consultation work starting next Monday, with Chairman Liu's partnership discussions conducted via video conference. A weekend trip to Seattle the following month so Riley can visit our headquarters and meet the team she'd be interacting with regularly. And a 3-week pilot assignment in Beijing this summer, with full family accommodations and cultural orientation that treats the experience as educational adventure rather than business requirement. 3 weeks in Beijing? Riley's eyes widened with excitement that seemed to exceed any remaining anxiety about change. Would I get to see the Great Wall and learn calligraphy and maybe meet kids who speak Mandarin as their first language? "All of that and more," Victoria confirmed. "Beijing has incredible educational programs for international families, and your father's diplomatic connections would provide access to cultural experiences that most tourists never see." Brian realized that Victoria's implementation plan addressed every concern he'd raised while providing Riley with opportunities that could expand her worldview in ways that Oregon could never match. The decision no longer felt like choosing between security and risk, it felt like choosing between limitation and possibility. "Victoria," Brian said, extending his hand across the table with the formal courtesy that had once characterized diplomatic agreements, "Riley and I would like to accept your offer and begin the transition process you've outlined."
As they shook hands, Brian felt the profound sense of stepping into an unknown future that was simultaneously terrifying and inevitable. The carefully constructed life that had provided 3 years of stability was about to be replaced by opportunities that promised growth, adventure, and professional fulfillment in equal measure. Riley clapped her hands with delight, already imagining adventures that would take them far beyond the familiar boundaries of their Oregon life. For the first time since Sarah's death, Brian found himself genuinely excited about what tomorrow might bring. 18 months later, Brian Gome stood in the conference room of the Shanghai International Business Center, watching Riley practice her calligraphy strokes with Master Chen while he prepared for a video conference with executives from 3 different continents. The transformation in their lives felt both gradual and dramatic, a series of carefully managed transitions that have evolved into a lifestyle neither of them could have imagined during their Oregon days. Riley, now 10 years old, spoke Mandarin with the fluency that came from daily immersion rather than textbook study. Her calligraphy practice filled notebooks that traveled with them between Seattle, Beijing, and their maintained home in Beaverton, where Mrs. Patterson still provided the emotional anchor that grounded their increasingly international existence. The worried 8-year-old who had fainted from anxiety about change had evolved into a confident young diplomat who served as cultural bridge between American business executives and Chinese partners who were charmed by her bilingual abilities. "Baba," Riley called across the conference room, using the Mandarin term for father that had become natural during their extended Beijing assignments. "Master Chen says my character formation is improving, but I need to practice patience with the brushstrokes. Maybe like how you had to practice patience with your career changes."
Brian smiled at his daughter's insight, recognizing how their international experiences had enhanced her ability to make connections between seemingly unrelated concepts. "Hen ha de guancha," he replied in Mandarin, praising her observation while continuing to prepare his presentation materials. Patience is important for calligraphy, career development, and diplomatic relationships. The video conference would connect them with Victoria Zhang in Seattle, Chairman Liu in Beijing, and representatives from 4 European companies that were seeking to establish manufacturing partnerships in China. Brian's role as cultural liaison had expanded far beyond Nexus Dynamics' original consulting needs to include facilitation of international relationships that represented over $10 billion in successful partnership agreements. Master Chen, who had become Riley's calligraphy instructor and cultural mentor during their Beijing stays, finished the lesson and approached Brian with the respectful formality that characterized their professional relationship. "Mr. Gome, Riley's progress continues to be exceptional. Her understanding of Chinese cultural nuances is developing alongside her language skills in ways that suggest genuine bicultural competence." "She's had excellent teachers," Brian replied in Mandarin, acknowledging Master Chen's contributions to Riley's education, as well as the broader network of international educators who had embraced their family's unique learning approach. "But she's also had a father who models cultural respect and genuine curiosity about different ways of understanding the world," Master Chen replied. "That foundation makes formal instruction much more effective." As Master Chen departed, Brian reflected on how their international lifestyle had created educational opportunities that traditional schooling could never have provided. Riley's formal education now included elements from American, Chinese, and international curricula, with language instruction that made her trilingual in English, Mandarin, and increasingly functional Spanish. Her medical care was managed by specialists in 3 countries who coordinated her treatment through the comprehensive international health network that Victoria's benefits package had provided. More significantly, Riley's chronic condition had become a non-issue rather than a defining limitation. The stress-related episode that had triggered their careful decision-making process had been the last medical crisis they'd experienced. International travel, cultural immersion, and the confidence that came from successfully navigating complex environments had enhanced her resilience rather than undermining her health. The video conference began promptly at 2 p.m. Shanghai time, connecting Brian with the international business leaders who had become his regular collaborators over the past year.
Victoria appeared on screen from her Seattle office, but her role had evolved from Brian's employer to his business partner in an expanding cultural consulting firm that served multinational corporations throughout the Pacific Rim. "Good afternoon, everyone," Brian began in English before switching to Mandarin for Chairman Liu's benefit. "Today's discussion will focus on the intellectual property protocols that European manufacturers need to understand when establishing production partnerships in China." For the next hour, Brian facilitated conversations that required not just linguistic translation, but cultural interpretation of business practices that could make the difference between successful partnerships and expensive misunderstandings. His diplomatic background provided the foundation for these interactions, but 18 months of practical experience had refined his abilities to serve corporate clients whose needs were more complex than embassy protocols had typically addressed. Riley sat quietly at the conference table, occasionally taking notes in Chinese characters while following conversations that switched between languages with the fluid ease that characterized international business. Her presence had become normal for clients who appreciated her cultural insights and were often charmed by her ability to explain American perspectives in perfect Mandarin or Chinese cultural expectations in age-appropriate English. "Mr. Gome," said the representative from a German automotive company, "your daughter's observations about generational differences in Chinese business culture have been invaluable for our youth marketing strategies. Her perspective bridges cultural gaps that our adult consultants struggled to identify." Riley beamed with pride while maintaining the professional composure she'd developed through 18 months of exposure to high-level business conversations. "Thank you," she replied in careful English. "I think kids notice different things than adults. And when you're learning about cultures, having different perspectives helps everyone understand better." After the conference ended, Brian and Riley walked through the bustling streets of Shanghai toward their temporary apartment in the French concession district. Their international lifestyle included residences in 3 cities, but their emotional home remained the Beaverton house where Mrs. Patterson maintained their connection to Oregon community and American friendships. "Dad," said Riley as they navigated the evening crowds with the confidence that came from months of Shanghai familiarity, "do you remember when we were scared about leaving Oregon because we thought change would be too hard?" "I remember," Brian replied, thinking about the conversation in Riverside Cafe that had launched their transformation from careful stability to embraced adventure. "What do you think about those fears now?" "I think we were scared of the wrong things. We were worried about leaving familiar places, but the best part has been discovering that we can make new places familiar. We were worried about medical care, but I'm healthier now than I was when we never traveled. And we were worried about whether we could handle complicated situations, but handling them has made us stronger." Brian found himself genuinely moved by Riley's analysis of their transformation. Her insights reflected not just successful adaptation to international living, but genuine growth that had enhanced her confidence and capabilities in ways that routine stability could never have achieved.
"Do you miss anything about our old life?" Brian asked, genuinely curious about whether Riley experienced any regret about the choices they'd made. "I miss Mrs. Patterson," Riley admitted honestly, "but I video chat with her twice a week, and she's visiting us in Beijing next month. I miss some of my Oregon friends, but I've made new friends in Seattle and Shanghai who know about different cultures. I think missing people is normal, but it doesn't mean we made wrong choices." Their apartment building came into view as evening settled over Shanghai, and Brian realized that their international lifestyle had become not just manageable, but genuinely fulfilling in ways he'd never anticipated. The careful transition that Victoria had designed had evolved into permanent arrangements that served their family's needs while providing professional satisfaction that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. "Riley," Brian said as they entered their building's elegant lobby, "what do you want to be when you grow up? Your answer might be different now than it would have been 2 years ago." Riley considered the question with the seriousness she brought to important topics. "I want to help families like we used to be," she said finally. "Families where the parents have important skills but feel stuck because of medical problems or money problems or fear about trying new things. I want to help them discover that change can be good if you have the right support and if you're brave enough to trust that things can get better."
Brian felt his chest tighten with emotion as he realized that their transformation had not only enhanced their own lives, but had given Riley a sense of purpose that emerged directly from their shared experience of overcoming circumstances that had once seemed impossible to change. "That's a beautiful goal," Brian said, thinking about how their journey from airport maintenance to international consulting had demonstrated that exceptional abilities could find appropriate platforms when circumstances allowed and support systems existed. As they settled into their Shanghai apartment for another evening of homework in multiple languages and video calls with friends across multiple time zones, Brian reflected on the truth that their story represented: that talent recognition could transform not just individual careers but entire family trajectories when opportunities were designed to accommodate rather than ignore personal circumstances. Riley's homework included Mandarin literature, American history, and mathematics problems that required cultural context from different educational systems. Her learning environment exemplified the international competence that was becoming increasingly valuable in a globally connected world. But more importantly, it reflected the confidence and curiosity that had replaced the anxiety and limitation that had once defined their choices. "Dad," Riley said as she organized her multilingual homework materials, "tomorrow can we visit the calligraphy exhibit at the Shanghai Museum? Master Chen said they have examples of diplomatic correspondence from the Qing dynasty, and I want to see how official Chinese writing looked during historical negotiations." Brian smiled at his daughter's sophisticated interests, recognizing how their international experiences had cultivated intellectual curiosity that would serve her well regardless of whatever career paths she eventually chose to pursue. "Of course," he replied, understanding that tomorrow would bring another day of opportunities that hadn't existed during their careful Oregon routine but had become natural elements of their transformed life. Outside their windows, Shanghai glittered with the energy of a city that bridged ancient traditions and modern innovations, much like their family had learned to bridge stability and adventure, security and international possibility. Their story had evolved from desperate crisis management to confident international partnership, proving that sometimes the most valuable bridges are built not between countries, but between the life you've carefully constructed and the life you never dared to imagine was possible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.